The blood had long since dried on Frank Ramirez's knuckles, but Carol Gutierrez could still see the dark stains beneath his fingernails as he reached for another bottle. The saloon's lamplight caught the cruel curve of his smile, the same expression that had been the last thing three women saw before their worlds went dark. But Carol didn't flinch. She couldn't afford to. Not with her swollen belly pressing against the bar's edge and nowhere left to run. The silence stretched between them like a taut rope, every eye in the dusty establishment fixed on the pregnant woman who had dared to meet Frank's gaze without looking away. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her brown eyes remained steady, unwavering. She had learned something in the months since her husband's death, something that the other women hadn't known when they crossed Frank Ramirez. Sometimes the only way to survive a predator was to convince him you weren't prey. Frank's weathered face twisted into something that might have been amusement if it hadn't been so cold. He set the bottle down with deliberate slowness, the glass meeting wood with a soft clink that seemed to echo through the hushed room. He said, his voice carrying the lazy drawl of a man who had never met consequences he couldn't buy his way out of. "Look what we have here." The words hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Carol's fingers tightened around the worn fabric of her dress, but she didn't move. Couldn't move. This moment had been building for weeks, ever since she'd arrived in Millbrook with nothing but the clothes on her back and a child growing in her belly. She'd heard the whispers about Frank Ramirez, seen the fear that flickered across women's faces when his name was mentioned. She'd also seen the graves at the edge of town, three fresh mounds that the townspeople spoke of only in hushed tones. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in drama in the comments. The confrontation had been inevitable from the moment Carol stepped off the dusty stagecoach 3 weeks ago, her pregnant form drawing stares and whispers from the assembled crowd. Millbrook wasn't the kind of place that welcomed strangers, especially not women traveling alone in their condition. But Carol Gutierrez had learned to make her own welcome, to carve out space for herself in a world that seemed determined to deny her existence. She had arrived with the morning sun painting the desert landscape in shades of gold and crimson, her few possessions clutched in a worn carpet bag that had seen better days. The stagecoach driver, a grizzled man named Luis Ruiz, had helped her down with surprising gentleness, his calloused hands steady as she found her footing on the uneven ground. "Qué va tu?" he had asked, his dark eyes filled with concern. "Quatuatrio." Carol had simply nodded, her hand resting protectively over her rounded belly. "Quote 4, she had replied, her voice carrying a quiet determination that surprised even her. Quote 5, Lewis had studied her face for a long moment, taking in the set of her jaw and the way she held herself despite her obvious exhaustion. Something in her expression must have convinced him, because he'd simply tipped his hat and wished her luck. But as the stagecoach rolled away in a cloud of dust, Carol had caught the worried glance he threw back over his shoulder. The town of Millbrook stretched before her like a collection of weathered bones scattered across the desert floor. The main street was little more than a wide dirt path flanked by false-fronted buildings that had seen better decades. A general store, a blacksmith shop, a small church with a crooked steeple, and at the far end, the Prairie Rose Saloon, where the town's men gathered to drink away their troubles and their wages. It was in front of the general store that Carol first heard Frank Ramirez's name spoken aloud. She had been examining a display of canned goods, trying to calculate how far her meager savings would stretch, when two women approached the counter behind her. Their conversation carried the particular tone of gossip shared between old friends, voices lowered but not quite whispered. Quote 6. The first woman asked, her voice tight with barely contained fear. The second woman, older and wearing a faded blue dress that had been mended more times than Carol could count, shook her head. Quote 7, quote, "Oh, mom." The first woman continued. Quote, "Easton." The older woman's face went pale. "Hush now, Kimberly. You know better than to speak of such things where others might hear." But Carol had already heard enough. She turned slowly, her pregnant form making the movement awkward, and caught the eye of the woman called Kimberly. The fear she saw there was raw and immediate, the kind of terror that came from knowing exactly what monsters walked among them. "Excuse me," Carol said softly, her voice carrying just enough to reach the two women without drawing attention from the store's other customers. Quote well. Kimberly Walker's eyes widened, and she glanced nervously toward the store's front window, as if expecting to see the man himself materialize on the street outside. Godfrey 13. The older woman who introduced herself as Martha pulled Kimberly aside with a sharp look. Quote 14. She said firmly, but her eyes held a warning that was meant kindly. Quote 15. But Carol had nowhere else to go. Her husband's death 6 months earlier had left her with nothing but debts and the growing life inside her. She'd sold everything of value to pay for the stagecoach ticket to Millbrook, following a half-remembered story about distant relatives who might take her in. The relatives had turned out to be a fiction born of desperation, but by then it was too late to turn back. She found lodging at the town's only boarding house, a sagging two-story structure run by a widow named Mrs. Patterson, who asked no questions as long as the rent was paid in advance. The room was small and sparse, containing little more than a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single chair positioned near the window that looked out over the main street. But it was hers, at least for as long as her money lasted. From that window, Carol began to observe the rhythms of Millbrook's daily life. She watched the men heading to work at the nearby copper mine, their faces already streaked with dust before the day had properly begun. She saw the women hurrying through their errands, their eyes downcast and their movements quick and purposeful. And she noticed how the street would empty whenever a particular figure emerged from the Prairie Rose Saloon. Frank Ramirez was not an imposing man in the traditional sense. Of average height and build, with graying hair and lines around his eyes that spoke of too many years under the desert sun, he might have passed for any other middle-aged rancher or businessman. But there was something in the way he moved, a predatory confidence that marked him as dangerous as surely as if he'd worn a sign around his neck. Carol watched him from her window as he conducted his business around town, noting how conversation stopped when he approached and resumed only after he'd moved on. She saw the way women crossed to the other side of the street when they spotted him coming, and how even the men seemed to defer to him with a mixture of fear and grudging respect. It was during her second week in Millbrook that Carol learned more about the three women who had disappeared. Linda Cox had been a seamstress, a quiet woman in her 30s who had lived alone above her shop. Samantha Taylor had been barely 18, the daughter of a farmer who lived outside of town. And Linda Wood, the most recent to vanish, had been a widow like Carol herself, though younger and without the burden of an unborn child. The details came to her in fragments, whispered conversations overheard in the general store or the boarding house dining room. Each woman had been seen talking to Frank Ramirez in the days before her disappearance. Each had been found to be missing personal belongings, as if they had planned to leave town voluntarily. And each had simply vanished without a trace, leaving behind only questions and the growing certainty among the townspeople that Frank Ramirez was responsible. But knowing and proving were two different things, and Frank Ramirez was a man with influence in Millbrook. He owned significant shares in the copper mine that provided most of the town's employment. He held mortgages on several of the local businesses, and he had the ear of the territorial marshal, a man named Tyler Edwards, who visited Millbrook once a month and seemed disinclined to investigate disappearances that might have simple explanations. Carol's own situation grew more precarious with each passing day. Her savings dwindled as she paid for room and board, and her pregnant condition made it increasingly difficult to find work. The few jobs available to women in Millbrook required physical capabilities that her growing belly made impossible. She had approached the seamstress shop hoping to take over Linda Cox's business, only to discover that Frank Ramirez now held the lease on the building. It was this discovery that led to their first direct encounter. Carol had been standing outside the empty shop, peering through the dusty windows at the abandoned sewing machine and bolts of fabric, when a shadow fell across the glass. She turned to find Frank Ramirez watching her with the calculating gaze of a man evaluating livestock. "Interested in the shop?" he asked, his voice deceptively casual. "Shame what happened to Linda, such a talented woman, but I suppose she decided the big city offered better opportunities." Carol met his eyes directly, something she noticed few people in Millbrook seemed willing to do. "I was hoping to inquire about taking over the lease," she said, her voice steady despite the warning bells ringing in her head. Frank's smile was all teeth and no warmth. "Portishire." The invitation hung between them like a trap waiting to be sprung. Carol could feel the weight of his attention, the way his eyes lingered on her form with an interest that had nothing to do with her sewing abilities. This was how it had started with the others, she realized. The seemingly innocent overtures that led to private meetings and then to nothing at all. Quote 20, Carol replied carefully. Quote 21. Something flickered across Frank's face, a brief shadow that might have been annoyance or something darker. But his smile remained in place as he tipped his hat. Of course, Senora. Tomorrow morning it is. But tomorrow morning never came. When Carol arrived at the shop the next day, she found a notice posted on the door declaring the building condemned due to structural concerns. The condemnation bore the signature of the town's building inspector, a man who happened to be Frank Ramirez's brother-in-law. The pattern became clear to Carol over the following days. Every avenue she explored for employment or business opportunity led back to Frank Ramirez in one way or another. The boarding house where she stayed was owned by a woman who owed Frank money. The general store where she might have found work was supplied by Frank's freight company. Even the church, where she had hoped to find sanctuary and perhaps assistance, received significant donations from Frank's mining interests. She was being systematically isolated, cut off from any means of supporting herself or her unborn child. It was a slow strangulation, designed to leave her with no choice but to accept Frank's help on his terms. Carol recognized the strategy because she had seen it before, in the mining camps where her late husband had worked. Men like Frank Ramirez understood that desperation made people pliable, that fear could be more effective than force in achieving their goals. But Carol Gutierrez had not survived her husband's death in the long journey to Millbrook by being easily broken. She had learned to read the signs of danger, to trust her instincts when they screamed warnings, and every instinct she possessed told her that accepting Frank's help would be signing her own death warrant. Instead, she began to prepare for the confrontation she knew was coming. She studied Frank's habits, noting when he conducted his business and where he spent his evenings. She observed the townspeople's reactions to him, identifying those who feared him most and those who might be potential allies. And she began to understand the true scope of his power in Millbrook. Frank Ramirez was not simply a man who preyed on vulnerable women. He was a cancer that had grown throughout the town's economic and social structure, his influence spreading like poison through every aspect of daily life. The mine workers feared losing their jobs if they crossed him. The business owners owed him money or depended on his trade. Even the town's few law enforcement officials seemed reluctant to investigate crimes that might implicate such an important citizen. It was this realization that led Carol to seek out Kyle Diaz, a former mine worker who had been blacklisted after asking too many questions about safety conditions. Kyle lived on the outskirts of town in a small cabin that he'd built with his own hands, supporting himself through odd jobs and hunting. He was one of the few men in Millbrook who didn't seem afraid of Frank Ramirez, perhaps because he had already lost everything the man could take from him. Carol found Kyle repairing a fence behind his cabin, his movements economical and precise despite the obvious pain in his left leg, a reminder of the mining accident that had ended his career underground. He looked up at her approach, his weathered face showing surprise at finding a pregnant woman walking the dusty path to his isolated home. Quote 23, he said, setting down his tools and wiping his hands on a rag. Quote darn. Quote darn to Carol replied directly. Quote 26, Kyle studied her for a long moment, taking in her determined expression and the way she held herself despite her obvious exhaustion from the walk. Quote 27, Carol explained her situation, describing the systematic way Frank had cut off her opportunities and the growing pressure she felt to accept his advances. Kyle listened without interruption, his face growing darker as she detailed the pattern of isolation and intimidation. Quote 28, Kyle said when she finished. Quote 29, quote 30. Kyle shook his head. Quote turned. The implications hung heavy between them. If Linda Wood had been preparing to leave town and had still disappeared, it suggested that Frank's reach extended beyond Millbrook's borders. It also meant that running might not be an option for Carol, even if she had the resources to attempt it. Kyle asked, his voice carefully neutral. Carol was quiet for a long moment, her hand resting on her swollen belly as she felt the child move restlessly inside her. Quote 33. Quote 34, quote 35, Carol said slowly. Quote 36, Kyle's expression was skeptical. Frank Ramirez has more than fear backing him up. He has money, influence, and men willing to do his bidding. You're one pregnant woman with no resources and no allies. I have you, Carol said simply. You don't even know me. I know you're the only man in this town who's willing to have this conversation. That's enough for now. Kyle was quiet for a long time, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains that rose like jagged teeth against the evening sky. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old wounds and older regrets. My sister was one of the first, he said quietly. This was before Linda Cox, before Frank had perfected his methods. Maria was working at the saloon trying to save enough money to get to California. Frank took a liking to her, started making offers she kept refusing. One night she didn't come home. They found her body in the desert 3 days later, beaten and left for the buzzards. Carol felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. I'm sorry. The marshal ruled it an accident, said she must have gotten lost trying to walk to the next town. Never mind that Maria knew the desert better than most men, or that she'd been talking about Frank's unwanted attention to anyone who'd listen. Kyle's hands clenched into fists. Quote 45. Quote eternal. Kyle's smile was bitter. Where would I go? This is my home. My family's land. Maria's buried here. I'm not going to let Frank Ramirez drive me away from the only place I've ever belonged. The alliance that formed between Carol and Kyle was born of necessity and watered with shared grief. Over the following days, they began to piece together a fuller picture of Frank's activities and the network of fear that enabled them. Kyle's isolation from the town's social structure had given him a unique perspective on its darker workings, and Carol's fresh eyes helped him see patterns he had missed. They discovered that Frank's victims followed a specific profile. All were women without strong family connections in Millbrook, making their disappearances easier to explain away. All had been facing financial difficulties that made Frank's offers of assistance seem attractive. And all had been seen in Frank's company shortly before vanishing, usually under circumstances that could be interpreted as voluntary departure. The method was sophisticated in its simplicity. Frank would identify vulnerable women and begin a campaign of helpful gestures and friendly overtures. He would offer employment, assistance with debts, or solutions to pressing problems. When the women inevitably found themselves alone with him, whether for business meetings or social encounters, they would simply disappear. The bodies, when they were found at all, showed signs of violence that the territorial marshal consistently attributed to other causes. Wild animals, accidents, or the general dangers of desert travel provided convenient explanations that avoided uncomfortable questions about Millbrook's most prominent citizen. But Frank had grown careless with success, and Carol's arrival had presented him with a new type of challenge. Unlike his previous victims, she had refused his initial overtures and shown no signs of the desperation that made women easy prey. Her pregnancy should have made her more vulnerable, not less, and her continued resistance seemed to both frustrate and intrigue him. It was Alan Alvarez, the town's doctor, who provided the next piece of the puzzle. Carol had gone to him for a routine examination, one of the few services in Millbrook that Frank didn't directly control. Dieter Alvarez was a quiet man in his 50s who had practiced medicine in various frontier towns before settling in Millbrook. His office was sparse but clean, and his manner was professional despite the obvious strain of working in a community where asking too many questions could be dangerous. During the examination, Dr. Alvarez confirmed what Carol already knew about her pregnancy's progress. The child was healthy and developing normally, with birth expected in approximately 2 months. But it was what he said afterward, as Carol was preparing to leave, that provided the crucial insight she had been seeking. Mrs. Gutierrez, Dr. Alvarez said carefully, I feel obligated to mention that you are not the first pregnant woman to seek my services recently. In the past year, I've treated 3 other women in similar circumstances. Carol paused in adjusting her dress. Oh, Linda Cox came to me about 6 months ago. She was perhaps 3 months along at the time. Samantha Taylor was here just 2 months before her disappearance, also pregnant. And Linda Wood was carrying a child as well, though she was further along than the others. The implication struck Carol like a physical blow. Frank Ramirez wasn't simply targeting vulnerable women. He was specifically hunting pregnant women, and the timing of their disappearances suggested a pattern that went beyond random opportunity. Quote 52. Carol said slowly, quote 3. Dr. Alvarez's face was grave. That's just it, Mrs. Gutierrez. According to the official reports, none of these women were pregnant when they disappeared. The marshal's investigations make no mention of their conditions, and there's been no inquiry about missing infants. Carol felt the room spinning around her as the full horror of the situation became clear. Frank wasn't just murdering women. He was targeting expectant mothers, and somehow their pregnancies were being erased from the official record. The implications were too terrible to fully comprehend, but they explained the particular cruelty of his selection process. She left Dr. Alvarez's office in a daze, her mind reeling with questions and possibilities. Why would Frank target pregnant women specifically? What was he doing with the children? And how was he managing to keep such horrific crimes hidden from outside investigation? The answers began to emerge over the following days as Carol and Kyle dug deeper into Frank's business dealings and personal history. They discovered that he had connections to several orphanages in distant cities, institutions that paid well for healthy infants, with no questions asked about their origins. They learned that his freight company regularly made runs to these same cities, carrying cargo that was never inspected by local authorities. Most damning of all, they uncovered evidence that Frank had been making regular payments to Marshal Tyler Edwards, officially listed as consulting fees for security services, but actually functioning as bribes to ensure that certain investigations remained superficial. The picture that emerged was of a man who had turned the murder of pregnant women into a profitable enterprise. He would identify vulnerable expectant mothers, isolate them from potential support, and then eliminate them while selling their children to institutions that didn't scrutinize the sources of their acquisitions. The pregnant women of Millbrook weren't just victims of a predator's violence. They were inventory in a business that traded in human lives. This revelation changed everything for Carol. Her confrontation with Frank was no longer just about her own survival or even about justice for his previous victims. It was about stopping a monster who was literally harvesting children from murdered mothers and who would continue to do so as long as he remained free to operate. But the knowledge also made her situation exponentially more dangerous. If Frank discovered that she was investigating his activities, he would have no choice but to eliminate her immediately. The systematic nature of his crimes meant that he couldn't afford to let anyone live who understood the full scope of his operations. It was this realization that drove Carol to make a decision that Kyle tried desperately to talk her out of. She would confront Frank directly, in the most public setting possible, and force him to reveal his true nature before witnesses who couldn't be bought or intimidated into silence. The Prairie Rose Saloon on a Saturday night was the perfect stage for such a confrontation. The weekly gathering drew men from the mine, the surrounding ranches, and even some of the more respectable townspeople who came for the music and company. It was the one place in Millbrook where Frank couldn't control every variable, where his influence was diluted by alcohol and the presence of too many witnesses to silence. Carol spent the week preparing for the encounter, studying every detail of the saloon's layout and the habits of its regular patrons. She identified potential allies among the crowd, men who might be willing to stand with her if she could prove Frank's crimes. She also prepared for the possibility that the confrontation would end in violence, hiding a small knife in the folds of her dress and arranging for Kyle to be positioned where he could intervene if necessary. The night arrived with a thunderstorm building on the horizon, the air thick with the promise of rain and the electric tension that preceded desert downpours. Carol dressed carefully in her best remaining dress, a dark blue garment that had belonged to her mother and still carried the faint scent of lavender. She arranged her hair simply but neatly, wanting to project dignity and strength rather than desperation or fear. As she walked toward the Prairie Rose Saloon, her swollen belly making each step an effort, Carol reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 6 months ago, she had been a grieving widow with nowhere to turn. Now she was a woman preparing to face down a killer in defense of children who would never be born if she failed. The saloon's doors swung open before her, releasing a wave of sound and smoke and the mingled scents of whiskey and unwashed bodies. Every conversation stopped as she stepped inside, her pregnant form drawing stares of surprise and disapproval from the assembled crowd. Women didn't frequent the Prairie Rose, especially not women in her condition, but Carol walked steadily toward the bar, her eyes scanning the room until she found her target. Frank Ramirez stood near the far end of the bar, a half-empty bottle of whiskey at his elbow, and an expression of cruel amusement spreading across his face as he realized what was happening. The confrontation that had been building for weeks was finally at hand. In the sudden silence of the saloon, with the storm breaking overhead and lightning illuminating the windows, Carol Gutierrez prepared to face the man who had murdered three women and planned to make her the fourth. She could feel the weight of every eye in the room, the tension crackling like electricity in the air. Frank's smile widened as she approached, his confidence absolute in his own power and the certainty that no one would dare challenge him in his own domain. But as Carol drew closer, her hand instinctively moving to protect her unborn child, she saw something flicker in Frank's eyes that might have been uncertainty. For the first time since arriving in Millbrook, she wasn't running from him or trying to avoid his attention. She was walking directly toward him with purpose and determination, and that simple act was already changing the dynamic between them. The blood had long since dried on Frank Ramirez's knuckles, but Carol could still see the dark stains beneath his fingernails as he reached for another bottle. The moment had come, and there would be no turning back from whatever happened next. The silence in the Prairie Rose Saloon stretched like a held breath as Carol approached the bar where Frank Ramirez waited. Every patron seemed frozen in place, their conversations dying mid-sentence as they witnessed something unprecedented in Millbrook's recent history. A pregnant woman walking deliberately toward the town's most dangerous man, her chin raised and her eyes locked on his with an intensity that made the air itself seem to crackle. Frank's fingers tightened around his whiskey bottle, the glass catching the lamplight as his smile faltered for just a moment. He had expected many things from Carol Gutierrez, but this direct confrontation in front of witnesses was not among them. The other women had been easier to handle, their fear making them predictable. But Carol moved with the steady purpose of someone who had already counted the cost of her actions and found it acceptable. "Well now," Frank said, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet room, "this is unexpected. The Prairie Rose doesn't usually welcome ladies in your condition." Carol stopped just beyond arm's reach, her hand resting protectively on her swollen belly. Quote, 57, a murmur ran through the assembled crowd, men shifting uncomfortably in their chairs as they sensed the undercurrents of danger flowing between the two figures at the bar. Kyle Diaz pressed himself deeper into the shadows near the back wall, his hand moving instinctively to the knife at his belt. He had tried to talk Carol out of this confrontation, but he knew better than most that some battles couldn't be avoided forever. Frank's laugh was harsh and brittle. Quote 58. Quote 59. Carol replied, her voice carrying clearly through the room. Quote 60. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees as Frank's expression hardened. Several patrons began to edge toward the door, sensing that they were about to witness something that could prove dangerous for anyone who stayed to watch. But others leaned forward, drawn by the rare spectacle of someone openly challenging Frank Ramirez's authority. Quote 61. Frank asked, his voice deceptively mild. Quote 62. Carol's eyes never wavered from his face. I'm suggesting that you've made it impossible for me to earn an honest living in Millbrook, which leaves me wondering what you expect me to do to support myself and my child. The question hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Everyone in the room understood the implications, the way Frank operated and what he typically expected from women who found themselves in impossible situations. But no one had ever forced him to acknowledge it so directly, in front of so many witnesses. Frank set his bottle down with deliberate care, the glass meeting wood with a soft clink that seemed unnaturally loud in the hushed saloon. I think you may be misunderstanding the nature of the small-town economics, Mrs. Gutierrez. Business relationships in a place like Millbrook tend to be interconnected. That's simply the reality of frontier life. Is it also the reality of frontier life that women who refuse your business propositions tend to disappear? Carol asked, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind outside seemed to hold its breath as every person in the saloon absorbed the magnitude of what had just been said. Frank's face went through a series of expressions, surprise giving way to anger and then to something much colder and more dangerous. He said slowly, quote 67, quote sir, and Carol replied steadily. Quote 69, the murmur that ran through the crowd was louder this time, men exchanging glances and whispered comments as they processed information that many had suspected, but none had dared to voice. Kyle felt his heart hammering against his ribs as he watched Carol systematically dismantle the wall of silence that had protected Frank's crimes for so long. Frank's hand moved to his belt, where Carol could see the outline of a pistol beneath his jacket. But he didn't draw it, perhaps aware that doing so in front of so many witnesses would confirm everything she was suggesting. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a tone that carried clearly to Carol, but might not reach the farthest corners of the room. "You're playing a very dangerous game, Senora, one that you're not equipped to win." "I'm not playing anything," Carol said, her voice remaining at its previous volume. "I'm stating facts that anyone in this room can verify if they choose to look. 3 pregnant women have disappeared from Millbrook in the past year. All 3 were last seen with you. And somehow none of the official reports mention their pregnancies. Dr. Alan Alvarez shifted uncomfortably near the bar's far end, his medical bag clutched tightly in his hands. He had hoped to avoid being drawn into this confrontation, but Carol's words were forcing him to confront his own role in the conspiracy of silence that had enabled Frank's crimes. Frank straightened, his composure returning as he calculated his next move. The direct approach had failed to intimidate Carol, and her public accusations were creating exactly the kind of attention he had worked so hard to avoid. But he was a man who had built his power through careful planning and ruthless execution, and he wasn't without resources even in this unexpected situation. "These are very serious allegations," he said, his voice taking on the reasonable tone of a man addressing wild accusations. "And I think everyone here can see that they're coming from a woman who's clearly under considerable stress. Pregnancy can affect a woman's thinking, make her see threats where none exist." The attempt to dismiss her concerns as feminine hysteria was a calculated move, one that Frank had used successfully in the past to deflect uncomfortable questions. But Carol had anticipated this response, and she was prepared for it. "Dr. Alvarez," she called out, turning slightly to address the physician directly. "You examined all 3 women during their pregnancies, didn't you? You have medical records that confirm their conditions." Dr. Alvarez froze, his face pale, as he found himself suddenly at the center of the confrontation he had hoped to avoid. Every eye in the room turned toward him, waiting for his response to a question that could either support Carol's accusations or help Frank maintain his facade of innocence. Quote 77. Dr. Alvarez stammered, his voice barely audible above the storm that was beginning to rage outside. Quote 78. Carol pressed. Quote 79. The doctor's silence was answer enough for many in the room. Frank's influence over the town's institutions was well known, and the suggestion that even medical records could be altered or suppressed to serve his purposes sent a chill through the assembled crowd. Frank sensed the shift in the room's atmosphere, the way doubt was beginning to creep into the minds of men who had previously accepted his version of events without question. He needed to regain control of the situation before it spiraled beyond his ability to manage. Quote 80, he said, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to having his words treated as final. Quote 81. But as Frank moved toward Carol, intending to take her arm and forcibly remove her from the saloon, Kyle Diaz stepped out of the shadows. His movement was fluid and purposeful, placing him between Frank and Carol before anyone fully realized what was happening. Kyle said quietly, his hand resting casually on his belt near the handle of his knife. Frank's eyes narrowed as he recognized Kyle, the former mine worker who had been asking uncomfortable questions about his sister's death for months. The presence of an ally complicated the situation significantly, suggesting that Carol's accusations weren't the desperate ramblings of an isolated woman, but part of a coordinated effort to expose his activities. "There's no one," Frank said, his voice dripping with false friendliness. "Yutapanan Kodaman," Kyle replied, his voice steady despite the anger burning in his eyes. "Kutahayanan." The mention of his sister's name sent a visible tremor through Kyle's frame, but his positioning remained solid, creating a barrier between Frank and Carol that couldn't be easily overcome without violence. Frank found himself in the unfamiliar position of being outmaneuvered in his own domain, his usual tactics of intimidation and isolation rendered ineffective by the public nature of the confrontation. "You're both making very serious accusations," Frank said, his tone becoming more formal as he recognized the need for a different approach. Accusations that could be considered slander if you can't provide proof to support them. The proof is in the pattern, Carol said, stepping slightly to Kyle's side so she could address the room directly. Gashanan, a crash of thunder punctuated her words, the storm outside reaching its full fury as rain began to hammer against the saloon's windows. The sound seemed to underscore the drama playing out inside, nature itself providing a soundtrack to the confrontation that was reshaping the power dynamics of Millbrook. Frank's hand moved closer to his weapon, but he hesitated as he calculated the consequences of drawing it. Killing Carol and Kyle in front of so many witnesses would be difficult to explain away, even with his influence over the local law enforcement. But allowing them to continue their accusations could be equally dangerous to his carefully constructed empire. Frank said slowly, the invitation was phrased as a suggestion, but everyone in the room understood it as a threat. Frank was offering Carol one last chance to back down, to accept his control and disappear quietly like the women before her. The alternative was implicit in his tone and the way his hand hovered near his weapon. Carol felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her like a physical force. This was the point of no return, the moment when she would either submit to Frank's will or commit herself to a course of action that could only end in violence or death. Her unborn child moved restlessly in her womb, as if sensing the danger that surrounded them both. I think, Carol said, her voice carrying clearly through the room, despite the storm raging outside, that any private conversation between us would end the same way your private conversations with the other women ended. The accusation was now explicit, leaving no room for misinterpretation or diplomatic retreat. Frank's face darkened as he realized that Carol had forced him into a position where he would have to either act against her publicly or allow her to continue exposing his crimes to an ever-widening audience. Tamid, he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than a shout. Kotasm, Carol replied. Kodam. The standoff stretched between them like a taut wire, ready to snap at the slightest provocation. Around them, the saloon's patrons watched in fascination and growing fear as they witnessed the collapse of the careful balance of power that had governed their town for so long. Some began to edge toward the exits, sensing that violence was inevitable and wanting no part of whatever was about to unfold. But others remained, drawn by the spectacle of seeing Frank Ramirez challenged so directly and effectively. These were men who had suffered under his influence, who had lost jobs or opportunities or loved ones to his machinations. For them, Carol's courage was offering something they had thought impossible, hope that their tormentor might finally face consequences for his actions. Kyle sensed the shift in the room's atmosphere, the way some of the patrons were beginning to look at Frank with expressions that contained more calculation than fear. The wall of intimidation that had protected the man for so long is developing cracks, and those cracks were spreading with each word Carol spoke. Tell them about the freight runs, Kyle said suddenly, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Tell them about the payments to Marshall Edwards and the connections to the orphanages in Denver and Santa Fe. Frank's composure finally cracked at the mention of specific details that should have been known only to his closest associates. His eyes darted around the room, taking in the faces of men who were now looking at him with open suspicion rather than fearful respect. The careful network of silence and intimidation that had protected his operations was unraveling before his eyes. Frank said, but his voice lacked its previous confidence. The specific nature of Kyle's accusations suggested a level of investigation that went far beyond casual suspicion, and Frank was beginning to realize that his enemies knew far more about his activities than he had believed possible. I know about the special cargo that travels with your freight wagons, Kyle continued relentlessly. Cargo that's never inspected by local authorities because Marshall Edwards makes sure the paperwork is always in order. Cargo that arrives at institutions that pay very well for healthy infants with no questions asked about their origins. The implications of Kyle's words hit the room like a physical blow. Several men cursed under their breath as they processed the full horror of what was being suggested. Frank Ramirez wasn't just a murderer. He was running a business that involved the systematic killing of pregnant women and the sale of their children to distant institutions. Dr. Alvarez made a strangled sound and stumbled toward the door, his medical bag falling from nerveless fingers as he fled the saloon. His reaction was as good as a confession, confirming that the medical professional who should have been protecting his patients had instead been complicit in their destruction. Frank's hand finally moved to his weapon, his fingers closing around the grip of his pistol as he realized that the situation had moved beyond any possibility of peaceful resolution. But as he began to draw the gun, several of the saloon's patrons rose from their chairs, their own hands moving to their weapons in response. "I wouldn't," said a voice from near the bar. The speaker was James Morrison, a mine foreman who had lost his position after questioning Frank's safety policies. To 100 firm, Frank found himself facing not just Carol and Kyle, but a room full of men who had suddenly discovered their courage. The balance of power that had protected him for so long had shifted in a matter of minutes, transformed by the simple act of a pregnant woman refusing to be intimidated. "Good morning," Frank said, his voice now openly threatening. "Quote will not when, quote wahane," Carol said steadily. Quote the threat was clear. Frank's crimes weren't just local matters that could be covered up through intimidation and bribery. They involved interstate commerce, federal laws, and institutions that would face serious consequences if their involvement in child trafficking became public knowledge. Frank's mind raced as he calculated his options. He could try to fight his way out of the saloon, but the odds were increasingly against him as more men joined the growing circle of those willing to stand against him. He could attempt to bargain, offering information about his associates in exchange for safe passage out of town, or he could make one last desperate play to regain control of the situation. "You want proof?" Frank said suddenly, his voice taking on a manic edge. "You want to know what happened to your precious missing women? I can show you proof." The offer hung in the air like a challenge, unexpected and potentially dangerous. Carol felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm raging outside as she realized that Frank might be offering to take them to the bodies of his victims. The prospect was both terrifying and necessary, the only way to finally obtain the evidence needed to bring him to justice. "Where?" Kyle asked, his voice carefully controlled despite the emotions roiling beneath the surface. Frank's smile was a twisted thing, containing more madness than humor. Quote 112. The revelation sent another wave of shock through the room. The mine shaft Frank was referring to had been the site of an accident that killed 3 workers, leading to its official closure and abandonment. If Frank was using it as a burial site for his victims, it would explain how the bodies had remained hidden for so long. "Auduman and 13, Carol asked, hardly able to believe that Frank would admit to his crimes so openly. Quote 114, Frank replied, his voice regaining some of its previous confidence. Quote 115, the threat was implicit but clear. Frank was suggesting that anyone who accompanied him to the burial site would join his victims there, that he was willing to eliminate all the witnesses to his confession rather than face the consequences of his crimes. It was a desperate gambit, but one that might allow him to regain control of the situation. Kyle stepped closer to Carol, his hand now openly resting on his weapon. But Frank's laugh was harsh and bitter. "Federal marshals? You think Marshal Edwards is the only lawman on my payroll? You think my reach doesn't extend beyond this little town? I've been operating for years without interference because I have protection at levels you can't even imagine." The claim was probably an exaggeration, but it contained enough truth to be disturbing. Frank's operations had indeed continued for an extended period without serious investigation, suggesting that his corruption had spread beyond the local level. The prospect of facing a network of compromised officials, rather than a single corrupt individual, made the challenge of bringing him to justice seem almost insurmountable. Quote 118 when Carol said firmly, quote 119, Frank's expression darkened as he realized that his threats weren't having their intended effect. Carol and Kyle weren't backing down despite the dangers he was describing, and the crowd of witnesses was growing rather than dispersing. His usual tactics of intimidation and isolation were proving ineffective against opponents who were willing to face the consequences of their actions. "You're forcing me to take measures I'd prefer to avoid," Frank said, his hand tightening on his weapon. "I've tried to handle this situation quietly, but you're making that impossible." The admission was as close to a confession as anyone in the room was likely to get. Frank was acknowledging that he had been trying to eliminate Carol and Kyle quietly, just as he had eliminated the women before them. But their public confrontation had forced him into a position where violence would be obvious and difficult to explain away. Thunder crashed overhead as the storm reached its peak intensity, the sound seeming to underscore the drama playing out in the saloon. Rain hammered against the windows with increasing force, and the wind howled around the building's corners like something alive and angry. In the flickering lamplight, Carol could see the faces of the men around her, reading the mixture of fear and determination in their expressions. These were people who had lived under Frank's shadow for too long, who had watched friends and family members suffer because of his actions. The confrontation she had initiated was giving them permission to acknowledge truths they had been forced to ignore, to stand up against a tyrant who had seemed untouchable. But she could also see the calculation in Frank's eyes, the way he was measuring distances and angles, preparing for the violence that seemed increasingly inevitable. He was a man who had killed before, who had refined his methods through practice and repetition. The desperation that was driving him now made him more dangerous than ever, a cornered predator with nothing left to lose. Quote 22, said a voice from the back of the room. Everyone turned to see Luis Ruiz, the stagecoach driver who had brought Carol to Millbrook, standing in the saloon's doorway with rain streaming from his coat. I've been listening from outside, and I think there's something you all need to know. Frank's face went pale as he recognized the newcomer. Luis Ruiz had been making regular runs between Millbrook and the surrounding towns for years, carrying passengers and freight along routes that would have given him opportunities to observe Frank's operations. His arrival at this crucial moment couldn't be coincidental. Quote 124. Frank said carefully, quote 25. But Lewis stepped fully into the saloon, shaking rain from his hat as he surveyed the tense scene before him. Quote 126. The implications of Lewis's words hit Frank like a physical blow. If the stagecoach driver had been documenting the shipments that formed the core of Frank's criminal enterprise, there would be an official paper trail that couldn't be suppressed or altered. The evidence would exist in territorial government files, beyond the reach of local corruption. Those records would show payments for transportation services, Frank said, but his voice lacked conviction. Nothing illegal about shipping legitimate freight. They would, Lewis agreed, if the cargo manifest matched the actual shipments. But I've been curious about those sealed crates that were always heavier than their listed contents suggested, heavy enough to contain more than the household goods and personal effects that were described in the paperwork. Carol felt a surge of hope as she realized that Lewis was offering the kind of concrete evidence that could finally bring Frank to justice. Official transportation records maintained by the territorial government would carry weight that local testimony might not, especially if they documented discrepancies that suggested criminal activity. Kyle moved closer to Lewis, recognizing an opportunity to gather additional information while Frank was still off balance. What kind of discrepancies are we talking about? The kind that suggests the crates contained living cargo, Lewis replied grimly. Cargo that required air holes and special handling instructions that weren't mentioned in the official manifests. Cargo that was always picked up by representatives of orphanages and charitable institutions, but never with the proper documentation that legitimate adoptions would require. Frank's hand moved toward his weapon again, but he hesitated as he realized that killing Lua would only confirm everything the man was saying. The stagecoach driver's testimony was already damaging enough without being martyred in front of witnesses. You're talking about things you don't understand, Frank said desperately. The orphanages I work with provide homes for children who would otherwise have nowhere to go. It's charitable work, helping infants find families who can care for them. Charitable work that involves murdering their mothers? Carol asked, her voice cutting through Frank's attempted justification like a blade. Quote 137. The questions hung in the air unanswered as Frank struggled to find a response that could explain away the mounting evidence against him. His criminal enterprise was being exposed piece by piece, each revelation making his position more untenable. Dr. Alvarez suddenly reappeared in the saloon's doorway, his face haggard and his clothes soaked from the rain. I can't do this anymore, he said, his voice barely audible above the storm. I can't keep pretending that what we've been doing is acceptable. Frank turned toward the doctor with an expression of pure fury. You agreed to the arrangement, Alan. You took the money and signed the documents. You're as guilty as anyone. I know what I've done, Doctor. Alvarez replied, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. I've been falsifying death certificates and birth records. I've been helping you erase evidence of pregnancies from women who were murdered for their children. I've been complicit in horrors that I can't even fully comprehend. The doctor's confession sent another wave of shock through the assembled crowd. The medical professional who should have been protecting his patients had instead been helping to cover up their murders, using his authority to legitimize Frank's crimes through fraudulent documentation. But I'm done, doctor. Alvarez continued. I'm going to the territorial authorities tomorrow. I'm going to tell them everything I know about your operations, about the bribes, about the falsified records, about the children who were sold to institutions that didn't ask enough questions. Frank's composure finally shattered completely as he realized that his carefully constructed network of corruption was collapsing around him. The doctor's testimony would provide the kind of professional credibility that could overcome any remaining doubts about the accusations being made against him. You'll destroy yourself along with me, Frank snarled. Your medical license, your reputation, your future. Everything you've worked for will be gone. Some things are more important than personal advancement, Alvarez replied quietly. I became a doctor to help people, not to enable monsters. If losing my license is the price of stopping you, then it's a price I'm willing to pay. The confrontation was reaching its climax as Frank found himself surrounded by enemies and abandoned by allies. His usual sources of power and protection were proving inadequate against opponents who were willing to sacrifice their own interests to bring him to justice. The pregnant woman who should have been his easiest victim had instead become the catalyst for his downfall. Carol could feel the tension in the room reaching a breaking point, the moment when words would give way to violence and the careful balance of the confrontation would shatter into chaos. Frank was a dangerous man who had killed before, and his desperation was making him increasingly unpredictable. It's over, Frank, she said quietly, her voice carrying clearly through the storm-filled silence. Too many people know the truth now. Too many witnesses have heard your confessions. Even if you kill everyone in this room, the evidence will still exist. The transportation records, the medical files, the connections to the orphanages. It's all going to come out. Frank's eyes darted around the room, taking in the faces of men who had once feared him, but now looked at him with disgust and determination. The empire he had built through terror and corruption was crumbling, and he could see no way to restore it. Quote 151, he asked, his voice taking on a desperate edge. Quote 152, quote 23, Kit Kyle said firmly. Quote 155. Frank's laugh was bitter and harsh. You have no idea what you're up against. The corruption goes deeper than you can imagine, reaches higher than you can touch. I'm just one small part of something much larger. The admission was both a threat and a confession, acknowledging that Frank's crimes were part of a broader network of corruption that extended beyond Millbrook's borders. But rather than intimidating his opponents, the revelation seemed to strengthen their resolve, confirming that their actions were part of a larger struggle for justice. Then we'll expose the whole network, Carol said steadily. We'll follow every connection, investigate every payment, document every crime. The truth has a way of spreading once it starts, and you can't stop it by killing the people who speak it. Frank's hand finally moved to his weapon, drawing the pistol with practiced speed as he realized that his situation had become hopeless. But as the gun cleared its holster, Kyle lunged forward, his own blade flashing in the lamplight as he sought to prevent Frank from firing into the crowd of witnesses. The two men crashed together in a tangle of limbs and steel, Frank's pistol discharging harmlessly into the ceiling as Kyle's knife sought vital targets. Around them, the saloon erupted into chaos as patrons dove for cover or drew their own weapons. The careful tension of the confrontation exploding into violence. Carol pressed herself against the bar as the fight raged before her, her hands instinctively protecting her unborn child from the danger that surrounded them. She could see Frank and Kyle rolling across the floor, each man fighting desperately for advantage as their weapons flashed and sparked in the flickering light. Frank was older but heavier, using his weight to try to pin Kyle down while bringing his pistol to bear. But Kyle was younger and more agile, his knife work precise and deadly as he sought to end the fight before Frank could bring his superior firepower into play. The struggle seemed to last forever, though it probably consumed only seconds. Frank managed to get his pistol pointed toward Kyle's chest, his finger tightening on the trigger as he prepared to fire at point-blank range. But Kyle's knife found its mark first, sliding between Frank's ribs with surgical precision. Frank's eyes went wide with shock and pain as he felt the blade penetrate his chest. The pistol fell from nerveless fingers as his strength ebbed, the weapon clattering across the wooden floor to rest against the bar near Carol's feet. Kyle rolled away from his opponent, breathing heavily as he watched Frank struggle to remain conscious. Blood was spreading across the man's shirt, dark and wet in the lamplight, and his face was growing pale as shock set in. "Karan," Kyle said quietly, his voice carrying clearly through the suddenly silent saloon. "Good 39. But Frank wasn't dead yet, and his eyes remained focused on Carol with an intensity that sent chills down her spine. You think you've saved them?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. "The children, they're already gone, sold and scattered across the territory. You'll never find them all." The words hit Carol like a physical blow as she realized the full scope of the tragedy. Frank's crimes hadn't just involved the murder of pregnant women. They had involved the theft and sale of dozens of children who were now lost in a network of institutions and families across the American West. "Where?" she demanded, kneeling beside Frank's prone form despite Kyle's attempts to hold her back. "Where did you send them? Which orphanages? Which families?" Frank's smile was weak, but still cruel. "Quote Wachimada." Dr. Alvarez pushed through the crowd to kneel beside Frank, his medical training overriding his personal feelings as he assessed the wounded man's condition. "He's telling the truth about one thing," the doctor said grimly. "He's dying. The knife punctured his lung and probably his heart. He has minutes at most." Carol felt a desperate urgency as she realized that Frank's death would take with him crucial information about the children he had stolen and sold. "Quote 167, Mom," she insisted. "Quote 168. Quote 169. Frank whispered, his voice growing weaker. The revelation that crucial evidence existed but was protected by Frank's corrupt ally created a new urgency. Marshall Edwards would indeed destroy any incriminating documents if he learned of Frank's death and confession, eliminating the last chance to trace the stolen children and bring the remaining conspirators to justice. Luis Ruiz stepped forward, his transportation experience making him the logical choice to coordinate a rapid response. Quote 171. Kyle struggled to his feet, wincing from injuries sustained in the fight, but determined to see the mission through. Quote 170. Quote 115, Frank whispered, his voice now so weak that everyone had to strain to hear him. Quote 24. Dr. Alvarez reached into Frank's pocket and withdrew a small brass key, its surface worn smooth by years of handling. The simple object represented access to information that could reunite stolen children with their families, or at least provide closure to parents who had never learned their children's fates. Frank's breathing became increasingly labored as his life ebbed away, but his eyes remained fixed on Carol with an intensity that suggested he had more to say. The children, your child, will be safe now, he whispered. But watch for the others. This network reaches farther than you know. With those words, Frank Ramirez died, his eyes losing focus as his breathing stopped entirely. The man who had terrorized Millbrook for years was finally gone, but his death raised as many questions as it answered. Carol remained kneeling beside the body for a long moment, her hand resting on her swollen belly as she processed the magnitude of what had just occurred. She had come to the Prairie Rose Saloon hoping to expose Frank's crimes and protect herself from becoming his next victim. Instead, she had witnessed the collapse of a criminal empire and gained access to information that could help dozens of stolen children. But she had also learned that Frank's operation was part of a larger network of corruption that extended far beyond Millbrook's borders. The fight for justice was far from over, and the dangers facing her and her unborn child might be greater than she had ever imagined. Kyle helped her to her feet, his strong hands steady despite his own injuries. He said quietly. Carol nodded, understanding the urgency but also feeling the weight of exhaustion that came from the intense confrontation and its violent conclusion. Her pregnancy made rapid movement difficult, but she knew that time was their most precious resource. Quote 179. Kyle continued. Quote 180. But Carol shook her head firmly. Quote, the argument was brief but intense, Kyle insisting that Carol needed medical attention, while she maintained that her presence was necessary to properly interpret the evidence they hoped to find. In the end, it was Dr. Alvarez who provided the compromise that allowed them to move forward. Quote 182, the doctor said, gathering his medical bag and checking its contents. Quote 183. The small group that prepared to leave the Prairie Rose Saloon consisted of Carol, Kyle, Dr. Alvarez, and Louis Ruiz, who insisted that his knowledge of transportation routes would be valuable in interpreting Frank's shipping records. Behind them, they left a crowd of townspeople who were still processing the shocking revelations they had witnessed. The storm was beginning to subside as they stepped out into the night, the rain reducing from a torrential downpour to a steady drizzle that made the unpaved streets treacherous with mud. Lightning still flickered in the distance, but the immediate fury of the weather was passing, leaving behind the clean scent of rain-washed air and the promise of clearer skies ahead. Frank's freight company occupied a two-story building near the center of town, its ground floor serving as a warehouse, while the upper level contained his private office and living quarters. The structure was dark and silent, its windows reflecting the occasional flash of distant lightning, like dead eyes watching their approach. Kyle used Frank's key to unlock the front door, the brass fitting smoothly into the lock mechanism despite the building's generally weathered appearance. Inside, the warehouse was filled with crates and boxes awaiting shipment, their contents unknown, but their presence suggesting that Frank's business operations had continued right up until his death. The stairs to the upper level creaked ominously under their weight, the sound seeming unnaturally loud in the building's silence. Carol found the climb difficult, her pregnant condition making each step an effort, but she persevered with Kyle's assistance and Dr. Alvarez's watchful monitoring. Frank's office was a study in contrasts, containing both the rough furnishings appropriate to a frontier freight operation and the fine appointments that reflected his considerable wealth. A large desk dominated the center of the room, its surface covered with papers and ledgers that would require careful examination. Along the walls, filing cabinets and safes suggested the presence of additional records that might prove valuable. But it was the painting Frank had mentioned that drew their immediate attention. The landscape depicted snow-capped mountains rising above a valley that filled with golden aspens, the kind of idealized Western scene that might appeal to Eastern investors or corrupt officials who wanted to believe they were participating in the romantic development of the frontier rather than enabling criminal enterprises. Kyle carefully lifted the painting from its mounting hooks, revealing a wall safe whose combination lock gleamed in the lamplight. The safe was larger than they had expected, suggesting that Frank had stored more than just documents behind its steel door. Now we need the combination, Kyle said, examining the lock mechanism for any clues that might help them open it without the proper sequence of numbers. Dr. Alvarez began searching Frank's desk, looking through papers and personal items for any indication of the combination. He said as he worked, quote 26. Carol joined the search, her eyes scanning the various documents scattered across the desk's surface. Most were routine business correspondence, shipping manifests, and financial records that seemed legitimate on first examination. But she noticed that certain papers were marked with symbols or notations that didn't match standard business practices. She said, holding up a ledger that contained columns of numbers and dates. Quote 1. Lewis examined the ledger over Carol's shoulder, his experience with transportation records allowing him to quickly identify the discrepancies. This is a second set of books, he said grimly. Frank was keeping separate records of his illegal shipments, probably to track payments and ensure he wasn't being cheated by his partners. The discovery of the hidden ledger was encouraging, but it didn't solve the immediate problem of opening the safe. Kyle continued to examine the lock mechanism while the others searched for clues. But time was passing, and they all knew that Marshall Edwards could arrive at any moment. It was Carol who noticed the small notation on the back of Frank's desk calendar, a series of numbers written in pencil and partially erased. Try this, she said, reading off the sequence to Kyle. The combination worked on the first attempt, the safe's heavy doors swinging open with a soft click that seemed to echo through the silent office. Inside, they found exactly what Frank had promised, a comprehensive collection of documents that detailed his criminal operations over several years. The records were meticulously organized, suggesting that Frank had maintained detailed documentation of his crimes either for blackmail purposes or simply out of a compulsive need to track his illegal profits. There were correspondence files with various orphanages and charitable institutions, payment records showing bribes paid to law enforcement officials, and most importantly, detailed shipping manifests that documented the transportation of stolen children to destinations across the American West. Carol felt her heart breaking as she examined the files, each document representing a child who had been torn from their murdered mother and sold into an uncertain future. The scope of the operation was staggering, involving dozens of children over several years in a network of corrupt officials and institutions that spanned multiple territories. Code 192. Kyle said, his voice tight with emotion as he processed the magnitude of Frank's crimes. If he destroys this evidence, these children will never be found. Dr. Alvarez had brought writing materials, and the four of them began the painstaking process of copying the most crucial information. Names, dates, destinations, payment amounts, and contact information for the various institutions that had purchased Frank's stolen children. Each detail was precious, representing a potential lead that could reunite a child with surviving family members or at least provide answers to parents who had never learned their children's fates. As they worked, Carol began to understand the true scope of the network Frank had mentioned in his dying words. The operation involved not just local corruption, but a systematic exploitation of the Western Territory's limited law enforcement and communication capabilities. Children could be stolen in one territory and sold in another with little risk of discovery, especially when local officials were being paid to overlook discrepancies in documentation. But the records also revealed weaknesses in the network that could be exploited by determined investigators. The institutions purchasing children had to maintain some legitimate documentation for their operations, and the transportation companies moving the stolen children had to keep records for territorial authorities. A comprehensive investigation could potentially trace every child and identify every corrupt official involved in the network. The sound of approaching horses interrupted their work, the clatter of hooves on the muddy street clearly audible through the office windows. Kyle moved to peer through the curtains, his expression grim as he identified the riders. He said quietly, "The arrival of Marshal Edwards and his armed companions created an immediate crisis for the group in Frank's office. They had managed to copy only a portion of the crucial records, and the approaching lawmen would certainly destroy any evidence that remained if they gained access to the safe." Carol felt a surge of panic as she realized that their discovery of Frank's records might prove worthless if they couldn't preserve the information or escape with what they had already copied. Her pregnancy made rapid movement impossible, and the building's layout offered limited options for avoiding the approaching men. Quote 196, Dr. Alvarez asked, his voice tight with tension as he continued copying records despite the approaching danger. Kyle shook his head grimly. Quote 97. Lewis moved to another window, trying to assess their tactical situation. Quote 1, he reported. Quote Dominion. The sound of heavy footsteps on the stairs below confirmed that their time was running out. Marshal Edwards and his men were already in the building, moving with the confidence of law enforcement officers conducting an official investigation. But everyone in the office knew that Edwards was there to destroy evidence rather than preserve it, that his badge provided cover for criminal activity rather than protection for innocent citizens. Carol made a desperate decision, gathering as many of the copied records as she could carry and stuffing them inside her dress, where her pregnant condition would help conceal them. Quote 201, she whispered to the others. Quote 201. Kylo and Dr. Alvarez followed her example, concealing copied documents in their clothing, while Lewis grabbed the original ledger that had first revealed the scope of Frank's operations. The remaining records would have to be left in the safe, where Edwards would certainly find and destroy them. The office door burst open just as they finished hiding the papers, Marshal Edwards entering with his weapon drawn and his face set in grim determination. Behind him came two deputies, their own guns ready as they surveyed the scene before them. Well, well, Edwards said, his voice carrying the mock authority of a corrupt official caught in an uncomfortable situation. What do we have here? Breaking and entering? Theft of private property, interfering with a federal investigation. Quite a collection of charges. Kyle stepped forward, his own hand moving toward his weapon before he remembered that Edwards and his men had the advantage of numbers and position. "Frank Ramirez is dead," he said quietly. "He confessed to murdering pregnant women and selling their children. The evidence is all here." Edwards' expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes that might have been relief or calculation. Frank Ramirez was a respected businessman and a pillar of this community. If he's dead, as you claim, then it's probably because of the false accusations and harassment he's been subjected to by troublemakers like yourself. The marshal's response confirmed what they had all suspected. Edwards had no intention of investigating Frank's crimes or bringing his associates to justice. Instead, he would use his official authority to suppress the evidence and eliminate the witnesses who could expose the network's operations. Quote, "Hours 207, Carol said, stepping forward despite Kyle's attempts to keep her behind him. Documentation of bribes paid to law enforcement officials, shipping manifests for stolen children, correspondence with corrupt institutions. The whole network is going to be exposed." Edwards' smile was cold and calculating. Quote 209. The threat was implicit but clear. Edwards intended to claim that any evidence they had discovered was fabricated or stolen, using his official position to discredit their testimony while destroying the documentation that could prove Frank's guilt. But Carol had anticipated this response, and she had prepared for it during the long weeks of planning that had led to this confrontation. "The records have already been copied and distributed," she lied smoothly. "Multiple copies are in the hands of people you can't reach, including territorial officials who aren't part of your corrupt network." Edwards' composure slipped slightly as he processed the implications of her claim. If copies of Frank's records were already in the hands of honest officials, then his efforts to suppress the evidence would be futile and potentially incriminating. "You're bluffing," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "You didn't have time to make copies or contact outside authorities." "Are you willing to bet your career and your freedom on that assumption?" Kyle asked, recognizing Carol's strategy and supporting it with his own implied threats. The standoff stretched between them as Edwards calculated his options. He could eliminate the witnesses and destroy the evidence. But if copies of the records really existed elsewhere, such actions would only confirm his guilt and ensure his eventual prosecution. Alternatively, he could attempt to bargain, offering information about the network in exchange for leniency. Dr. Alvarez chose that moment to step forward, his medical bag clutched tightly in his hands. Quote 206, he said formally, quote 207. The doctor's confession was another blow to Edwards' position, providing corroboration for the accusations being made against Frank and his network. A medical professional's testimony would carry significant weight with territorial authorities, especially when combined with the documentary evidence they had discovered. "Alan," Edwards said, his voice taking on a warning tone, "you need to think very carefully about what you're saying. False testimony against law enforcement officials is a serious federal crime. You could face years in prison." But Dr. Alvarez had already made his decision, his conscience finally overriding his fear of the consequences. "I'm more concerned about the women and children who died because of my cowardice," he replied steadily. "Prison would be a small price to pay for helping to bring their killers to justice." Edwards' face darkened as he realized that his network of intimidation and corruption was collapsing around him, just as Frank's had collapsed in the saloon. The careful balance of fear and greed that had held the conspiracy together was being destroyed by people who were willing to sacrifice their own interests for justice. "You're all making a terrible mistake," Edwards said, his voice taking on a desperate edge. "This network reaches higher than you can imagine. There are people involved who have the power to destroy anyone who threatens their interests. You think you're fighting for justice, but you're really signing your own death warrants." "Then we'll die fighting," Carol said simply, her hand resting protectively on her swollen belly. "But at least we'll die knowing that we tried to stop monsters from murdering innocent women and stealing their children." The simple dignity of her response seemed to deflate Edwards' remaining bluster. He was facing opponents who weren't motivated by greed or fear, but by a moral conviction that made them willing to accept any consequences for their actions. Such people were nearly impossible to intimidate or corrupt, making them extremely dangerous to criminal enterprises that depended on silence and complicity. "Last chance," Edwards said, raising his weapon to point directly at Carol's chest. But even as he made the threat, Edwards knew it was futile. The confrontation had moved beyond any possibility of peaceful resolution, and the evidence of his corruption was too extensive to be suppressed through intimidation alone. The network he had helped to protect was doomed, and his only remaining choice was whether to go down fighting or attempt to bargain for leniency. The moment stretched between them like a held breath, pregnant with the possibility of violence and the certainty that whatever happened next would determine the fate of dozens of stolen children in the future of justice in the American West. The moment stretched between them like a held breath, pregnant with the possibility of violence and the certainty that whatever happened next would determine the fate of dozens of stolen children and the future of justice in the American West. Marshal Tyler Edwards kept his weapon trained on Carol's chest, his finger hovering over the trigger as he weighed his rapidly diminishing options. The corrupt lawman's face was a mask of desperation and calculation, understanding that his carefully constructed network of intimidation and bribery was crumbling around him just as Frank Ramirez's empire had collapsed in the saloon below. Carol stood perfectly still, her hand resting protectively on her swollen belly as she met Edward's gaze with unwavering determination. The fear that had once driven her to flee from one town to another was gone, replaced by something far more dangerous to men like Edwards. She had found her purpose in the fight for justice, and that purpose made her willing to face any consequence, even death, to protect the innocent children whose lives hung in the balance. Quote 228, Carol said quietly, her voice carrying clearly through the tense silence of the office. Quote 249. Kyle shifted slightly, positioning himself to shield Carol from Edward's weapon while keeping his own hand near his knife. The former mine worker had already proven his willingness to fight for justice when he killed Frank Ramirez, and his steady presence provided Carol with the confidence she needed to continue her confrontation with the corrupt marshal, Dr. Alan Alvarez clutched his medical bag tighter, the weight of his confession still heavy on his conscience, but also liberating in its honesty. For months he had lived with the knowledge of his complicity in Frank's crimes, the falsified death certificates and altered medical records that had enabled the systematic murder of pregnant women. Now, facing the possibility of death at Edwards' hands, he felt a strange sense of peace knowing that he had finally chosen to stand with the innocent rather than the powerful. Luis Ruiz remained near the window, his transportation records and intimate knowledge of Frank's shipping operations making him a crucial witness to the scope of the criminal network. The stagecoach driver had seen too much during his years of carrying Frank's mysterious cargo to remain silent any longer, and his testimony could provide the concrete evidence needed to trace the stolen children across the territorial boundaries. Edward's eyes darted between the four people facing him, calculating the risks and benefits of different courses of action. He could kill them all and claim they had been armed criminals resisting arrest, but such a massacre would draw unwanted attention from territorial authorities who might not be as easily corrupted as local officials. Alternatively, he could attempt to bargain, offering information about the network in exchange for immunity from prosecution. Quote 230, Edwards said, his voice taking on the desperate edge of a man whose world was collapsing around him. Quote 231. Carol's expression didn't change, but Kyle could see the slight tightening around her eyes that suggested she was processing the implications of Edwards' words. The network they were fighting wasn't just a local conspiracy of corrupt officials and criminals. It was part of a systematic exploitation of the Western Territory's limited law enforcement capabilities, a business model that turned human trafficking into a profitable enterprise protected by layers of political influence and economic power. Then we'll expose them all, Kyle said firmly, his voice carrying the quiet determination of a man who had already lost everything that mattered to him. One by one, if necessary, but it starts here with you and Frank and the evidence in this room. Edwards laughed, but the sound was harsh and bitter rather than amused. You have no idea what you're up against. The corruption reaches into the territorial capital, into Washington itself. There are senators and congressmen who profit from this trade, who ensure that investigations get buried and witnesses disappear. Maybe, Carol replied steadily, but that doesn't change what we have to do. Those children deserve to be found and returned to their families. The women who were murdered deserve justice, and the people who enabled these crimes deserve to face the consequences of their actions. The simple moral clarity of her response seemed to deflate Edwards's remaining bluster. He was facing opponents who weren't motivated by personal gain or political ambition, but by a fundamental belief in right and wrong that made them nearly impossible to corrupt or intimidate. Such people were the greatest threat to criminal enterprises that depended on the silence and complicity of those who knew the truth but lacked the courage to speak it. Last warning, Edwards said, raising his weapon higher and taking deliberate aim at Carol's heart. But even as he made the threat, Edwards could see in Carol's eyes that it was futile. She had already made her choice, already accepted the possibility of death as the price of fighting for justice. The pregnant woman, who should have been his easiest target to intimidate, had instead become his most dangerous opponent, someone whose moral conviction made her willing to sacrifice everything for the sake of children she would never meet. Dr. Alvarez stepped forward, his medical training overriding his fear as he positioned himself between Edwards and Carol. Marshal, as a physician, I'm obligated to protect my patients from harm. Mrs. Gutierrez is carrying a child, and threatening her life violates every principle of human decency. Edward's face twisted with rage as he realized that his authority meant nothing to people who were willing to die for their principles. Quoted on, Carol said quietly, her voice carrying a strength that surprised even her. Quote. The accusation hit Edwards like a physical blow, forcing him to confront the reality of what he had become. He had started his career as a lawman with genuine intentions to serve and protect, but the isolation and limited resources of frontier law enforcement had gradually corrupted him. The bribes had started small, just supplemental income to support his family in a harsh environment, but they had grown over time, each compromise making the next one easier until he found himself protecting murderers and child traffickers in exchange for money. Kyle sensed the moment of Edwards's internal struggle and chose that instant to act. The former mine worker lunged forward with the same deadly precision he had shown in his fight with Frank Ramirez, his knife flashing in the lamplight as he sought to disarm the corrupt marshal before he could fire his weapon. But Edwards was younger and more alert than Frank had been, his reflexes honed by years of dangerous law enforcement work on the frontier. He managed to partially dodge Kyle's attack, the blade intended for his heart instead slicing across his gun arm and sending his pistol spinning across the floor. The two men crashed together in a tangle of limbs and desperation, Edwards fighting with the fury of a cornered animal, while Kyle pressed his attack with methodical determination. Around them, the office erupted into chaos as Dr. Alvarez grabbed Carol and pulled her toward the relative safety of the far wall, while Luis Ruiz scrambled to secure Edwards's fallen weapon. Carol pressed herself against the wall, her hands instinctively protecting her unborn child as she watched the life and death struggle playing out before her. Edwards was fighting not just for his freedom, but for his very survival, knowing that capture would mean facing federal charges for his role in Frank's criminal network. Kyle was fighting for justice, for his murdered sister and all the other women who had died because of the corruption that Edwards represented. The struggle seemed to last forever, though it probably consumed only seconds. Edwards managed to break free from Kyle's initial grapple and drew a second weapon, a small derringer hidden in his boot that he brought up toward Kyle's chest. But Dr. Alvarez intervened at the crucial moment, swinging his heavy medical bag with enough force to knock Edwards off balance and spoil his aim. The derringer discharged harmlessly into the ceiling as Edwards stumbled backward, his coordination disrupted by the unexpected blow. Kyle seized the opportunity to press his attack, his knife finding its mark between Edwards' ribs with surgical precision. Edwards' eyes went wide with shock and pain as he felt the blade penetrate his chest. The derringer fell from nerveless fingers as his strength ebbed, joining his primary weapon on the floor near Carol's feet. Blood was spreading across his shirt, dark and wet in the lamplight, and his face was growing pale as shock began to set in. "It's over," Kyle said quietly, stepping back from his fallen opponent while keeping his knife ready in case Edwards had any fight left in him. "The network is finished." But Edwards wasn't ready to surrender, even with death approaching. His eyes remained focused on the safe and the records it contained. Understanding that the evidence of his crimes would outlive him and potentially bring down the entire network he had helped to protect. Quote 45. He whispered, his voice growing weaker with each word. Quote 246. Carol knelt beside the dying marshal, her pregnant form making the movement awkward, but her determination overriding her physical discomfort. Quote 247, she demanded. Quote 248. Edwards's laugh was weak but still cruel. Why would I help you destroy everything I've worked to build? The network provides order in a chaotic world, ensures that resources flow to where they're needed most. The children we relocate get better lives than they would have had with their original families. You murdered their mothers, Dr. Todd Alvarez said, his voice tight with disgust. You stole newborn babies and sold them to the highest bidders. There's no justification for such evil. Evil, Edwards repeated, his voice growing fainter. Is it evil to ensure that children born to poverty and desperation get opportunities for better lives? Is it evil to provide wealthy families with the children they desperately want? We were solving problems, creating solutions that benefited everyone involved. The twisted logic of Edwards' justification revealed the depth of his moral corruption, the way he had rationalized his crimes as beneficial services rather than horrific violations of human dignity. Carol could see that he genuinely believed his own propaganda, that years of criminal activity had warped his perception of right and wrong beyond any possibility of redemption. Tom, Carol said firmly. Quote, Edwards's breathing was becoming increasingly labored as his life ebbed away, but his eyes remained fixed on Carol with an intensity that suggested he had more to say. Your child, he whispered, his voice barely audible. Frank had plans for your child. The buyer was already arranged, a wealthy family in California who were willing to pay premium prices for a healthy infant. The revelation hit Carol like a physical blow, forcing her to confront the reality that her unborn child had already been marked for theft and sale by Frank's criminal network. The systematic nature of the operation meant that her pregnancy had made her a target from the moment she arrived in Millbrook, that every interaction with Frank had been part of a calculated plan to isolate her and make her vulnerable to his predations. Kyle moved closer to Carol, his strong presence providing comfort and protection as she processed the horror of what Edwards was revealing. The former mine worker had suspected that Frank's interest in Carol was more than casual, but the confirmation that her child had already been sold to distant buyers made the threat even more personal and immediate. Who? Carol demanded, her voice shaking with a mixture of rage and fear. Who was going to buy my child? What family? What location? Edwards' smile was weak, but still malicious. Quote 200 Sky. The specific details of the transaction made Carol feel physically sick, understanding that her unborn child had been reduced to a commodity in Frank's twisted business model. The Hartwells had paid for a stolen baby with the same casual indifference they might show when purchasing livestock or household goods, never considering the mother who would die to provide their desired merchandise. Dr. Alvarez knelt beside Edwards, his medical training compelling him to assess the marshal's condition, despite his personal disgust for the man's crimes. He's dying, the doctor said quietly. If we want more information about the network, we need to get it now. Carol leaned closer to Edwards, ignoring Kyle's attempts to keep her at a safe distance from the wounded man. Taru 6'3", she said urgently. Quote 264. Edwards' breathing was becoming increasingly shallow, but he managed to focus his fading attention on Carol's face. Quote 265. He whispered. Quoted to Kyle Barrow demanded. Quoted to 216. Edwards replied, his voice now so weak that everyone had to strain to hear him. Quoted to 70. Luis Ruiz immediately moved to examine the safe more carefully, his transportation experience making him familiar with hidden compartments and concealed storage areas. His fingers probed the safe's interior walls, searching for any irregularities that might indicate the presence of a secret panel. Here, Lewis said suddenly, his exploration revealing a small catch hidden behind the safe's back wall. The mechanism clicked softly as he manipulated it, revealing a narrow compartment that contained additional files and documents. The hidden records were even more comprehensive than the shipping manifests they had already discovered, containing detailed profiles of the families who had purchased stolen children over the years. Names, addresses, payment amounts, and specific requirements were all meticulously documented, creating a paper trail that could potentially reunite dozens of children with their surviving relatives. Carol felt tears streaming down her face as she examined the files, each document representing a child who had been torn from their murdered mother and sold into an uncertain future. The scope of the operation was staggering, involving not just Frank's local crimes, but a network of buyers across the American West who were willing to pay premium prices for stolen infants. "We have everything we need," Dr. Alvarez said, his voice filled with a mixture of relief and determination. "These records contain enough information to trace every child and identify every corrupt official involved in the network." But Edwards wasn't finished revealing the network's secrets. With his last remaining strength, he managed to speak one final warning that chilled everyone in the room. "The network has protocols," he whispered. "If operations in one location are compromised, they activate contingency plans to protect the larger organization. By now, they know something has gone wrong in Millbrook." Kyle felt a surge of urgency as he processed the implications of Edwards' words. "Order 276, unquote, sounded Edwards replied, his voice fading to barely a whisper. Quote, with those words, Marshal Tyler Edwards died, his eyes losing focus as his breathing stopped entirely. The corrupt lawman who had enabled Frank's crimes for years was finally gone, but his death raised new questions about the network's reach and the dangers facing anyone who opposed their operations. Carol remained kneeling beside Edwards' buddy for a long moment, her hand resting on her swollen belly as she processed the magnitude of what they had discovered. The records they had found could reunite stolen children with their families and bring justice to the women who had been murdered. But they also made everyone involved in their discovery targets for elimination by the network's professional killers. Kyle helped her to her feet, his strong hands steady despite the violence he had just committed. He said quietly, Dr. Alvarez gathered the medical records and documentation he had been copying, his confession to territorial authorities, now more urgent than ever, he said. Louis Ruiz secured the transportation records and customer files, his knowledge of shipping routes making him the logical choice to coordinate the distribution of evidence to multiple authorities. Quote 283, he suggested. Quote 284. Carol nodded, understanding the wisdom of Louis's suggestion, but also feeling the weight of exhaustion that came from the night's intense confrontations and revelations. Her pregnancy made extended activity difficult, and the stress of facing death multiple times was taking its toll on both her and her unborn child. Quote 285. Dr. Alvarez said, his professional instincts overriding the urgency of their situation. Quote 286. But Carol shook her head firmly, her determination overriding her physical discomfort. Quote 287. Kyle admired Carol's courage but also understood the risks she was taking with her own health and that of her child. We can do both, he said diplomatically. Dr. Alvarez can examine you while Louis and I organize the evidence and plan our next moves. The compromise allowed them to address Carol's medical needs while continuing their work to expose the network's crimes. Dr. Alvarez conducted a brief examination using the limited resources available in Frank's office, confirming that both Carol and her baby appeared to be in good health despite the night's traumatic events. The baby's heartbeat is strong and regular, Doctor. Alvarez reported, there are no signs of distress or premature labor, but you need to rest soon, Mrs. Gutierrez. Your body can only handle so much stress before it begins to affect the pregnancy. Carol accepted the doctor's advice, but insisted on participating in the planning for distributing the evidence they had discovered. Her intimate knowledge of Frank's methods and her understanding of the network's operations made her insights valuable for determining which authorities could be trusted with the sensitive information. Quote 292, she suggested. Quote 293, Kyle examined the customer records more carefully, looking for patterns that might reveal additional aspects of the network's operations. These buyers aren't just random families looking to adopt children, he observed. Many of them are connected to specific industries or political organizations. This looks like a systematic effort to place stolen children in environments where they can be controlled or exploited. The observation added another layer of horror to the crimes they were investigating. The stolen children weren't just being sold to families who wanted to raise them as their own. Some were apparently being placed in situations where they could be groomed for specific purposes or used to maintain the network's influence across different sectors of society. Louis studied the shipping records with his transportation expertise, identifying routes and connections that revealed the network's geographical scope. Quote 296, he said grimly. Quote 297. Alvarez finished his examination of Carroll and began organizing his own records for distribution to territorial authorities. Quote 298, and he said. Quote 299. As they worked to organize the evidence and plan their next moves, the sound of approaching horses interrupted their activities. Kyle moved to the window, peering through the curtains to assess the new threat approaching through the pre-dawn darkness. He reported grimly. Booth 301. Carol felt a chill of recognition as she realized that Edward's warning about cleanup crews was proving accurate. The network's contingency plans were already being activated, professional killers dispatched to eliminate witnesses and destroy evidence before the crimes could be fully exposed. Quote 302. Dr. Alvarez asked, his voice tight with tension as he gathered his medical records and prepared for another confrontation. Kyle studied the approaching riders, estimating their speed and the time it would take them to reach Frank's building. Minutes at most, he replied. They're not trying to be subtle about their approach. This is a direct assault designed to eliminate everyone who knows about the network. Lewis secured the customer records and shipping manifests, understanding that preserving the evidence was more important than their individual survival. There's a back exit through the warehouse, and he said, if we move quickly, we might be able to escape before they surround the building. But Carol was studying the approaching riders with a calculating gaze, her mind working through the tactical situation with surprising clarity. They're expecting us to run, she said quietly. That's why they're approaching so openly. They want to drive us toward prepared positions where they can eliminate us without witnesses. Kyle recognized the wisdom of Carol's analysis, understanding that their opponents were professionals who had planned this operation carefully. Quote 309. Carol's hand moved to the weapons that Edwards and Frank had dropped during their respective fights, her fingers closing around the grip of Edwards' primary pistol. Quote 310, she said firmly. Quote 311. The decision to fight rather than flee transformed the atmosphere in Frank's office from desperate urgency to grim determination. Carol's tactical assessment had revealed the trap that awaited them if they attempted to escape, but it had also identified their advantages in defending their current position. The building's solid construction and limited access points would force the approaching killers to attack through predictable routes, while the evidence they had discovered provided motivation for a fight to the death. Kyle distributed weapons to their small group, ensuring that everyone was armed and understood their defensive responsibilities. Dr. Alvarez accepted a pistol with obvious reluctance, his medical training conflicting with the necessity of violence. But his commitment to protecting the evidence overrode his personal reservations about taking human life. Lewis positioned himself near the window that provided the best view of the approaching riders, his transportation experience making him familiar with the tactics used by professional security forces and criminal organizations. They're splitting up, he reported. 3 men approaching the front entrance, 2 moving around back, and 1 staying with the horses as a lookout. Carol checked the ammunition in Edward's pistol, her movements methodical despite her lack of formal weapons training. The necessity of defending herself and her unborn child had awakened instincts she didn't know she possessed, survival mechanisms that overrode her previous reluctance to engage in violence. Remember, Kyle said quietly, our primary objective is protecting the evidence. If it comes down to a choice between our lives and preserving these records, the records take priority. Those stolen children deserve justice more than we deserve to survive. The approaching footsteps on the stairs below confirmed that the assault was beginning, the sound of heavy boots moving with military precision toward their defensive position. Carol positioned herself behind Frank's heavy desk, the solid wood providing cover while allowing her to maintain a clear field of fire toward the office's main entrance. Dr. Alvarez crouched near the safe, his medical bag and the copied records positioned where they gave it on my gun, where they could be quickly secured if the situation deteriorated. His hands shook slightly as he gripped his unfamiliar weapon, but his face showed the same determination that had driven him to confess his role in Frank's crimes. The office door exploded inward as the cleanup crew's leader kicked it open, his assault revealing a man in his 40s with the scarred face and cold eyes of a professional killer. Behind him came 2 associates, their weapons ready, and their movements coordinated with the precision of military veterans turned criminal. Federal marshals, the leader announced, his voice carrying false authority as he surveyed the scene before him. "You're all under arrest for the murder of Marshall Edwards and the theft of federal evidence." Kyle's laugh was harsh and bitter. Quote, the leader's facade of official authority dropped immediately, his expression becoming openly hostile as he realized that deception wouldn't work against opponents who understood the network's methods. "Smart man," he said coldly, "too smart for your own good." Carol remained hidden behind the desk, her weapon trained on the doorway as she waited for the optimal moment to engage. Her pregnancy made mobility difficult, but it also provided motivation that transcended normal survival instincts. She was fighting not just for her own life, but for the future of her unborn child and the justice that dozens of stolen children deserved. "You know why we're here," the leader continued, his weapon moving to cover Kyle while his associates positioned themselves to control the room's other occupants. Quote 322, quote 323, Dr. Alvarez said, his voice steadier than his hands as he maintained his grip on his weapon. Quote 324. The leader's expression darkened as he processed the implications of the doctor's claim. If copies of the evidence were already beyond the network's reach, then eliminating the witnesses would serve little purpose beyond preventing additional testimony. But the systematic nature of the network's operations suggested that they would eliminate threats regardless of practical considerations, treating witness elimination as a standard procedure rather than a tactical necessity. Quote 325. The leader replied, signaling to his associates to begin their systematic elimination of everyone in the room. Quote 326. Kyle recognized the threat of torture and interrogation, understanding that the cleanup crew intended to extract information about the evidence's distribution before eliminating their sources. "You're wasting your time," he said firmly. "We're not going to tell you anything that helps your network continue operating." The leader's smile was cold and calculating. Quote 329. The threat against Carol and her baby was the final straw that shattered any remaining possibility of negotiation or surrender. Kyle lunged forward with the same deadly precision he had shown in his previous fights, his knife flashing toward the leader's throat as he sought to eliminate the most dangerous opponent first. But the cleanup crew leader was a professional killer with years of experience in close-quarters combat. He managed to partially deflect Kyle's attack while bringing his pistol to bear, the weapon discharging at point-blank range as the two men crashed together in a desperate struggle for survival. The gunshot seemed unnaturally loud in the confined space of the office, its sound echoing off the walls and temporarily deafening everyone present. Carol couldn't tell if Kyle had been hit, but she could see him still fighting with the leader, their weapons locked together as each man sought a fatal advantage. Dr. Alvarez chose that moment to overcome his medical training's prohibition against violence. Firing his pistol at one of the leader's associates with surprising accuracy, the bullet caught the man in the shoulder, spinning him around and disrupting his aim as he tried to bring his own weapon to bear on the doctor. Lewis engaged the third attacker, using his knowledge of the office's layout to maneuver behind cover, while returning fire with Edwards' backup weapon. The transportation specialist's familiarity with frontier violence served him well as he traded shots with a professional killer who had underestimated his opponent's determination and capability. Carol waited for her moment, watching the chaotic firefight while looking for an opportunity to contribute without endangering her unborn child. When the wounded associate stumbled within range of her position behind the desk, she fired Edwards' pistol with both hands, the heavy weapon bucking against her grip as the bullet found its target. The associate went down hard, his weapon skittering across the floor as he clutched his chest and struggled to breathe. Carol felt no satisfaction in taking a human life, but she understood that these men had come to murder everyone in the room and destroy evidence that could reunite stolen children with their families. Kyle's struggle with the leader was reaching its climax as both men fought with the desperation of those who understood that only one would survive the encounter. The leader's superior training was balanced by Kyle's emotional investment in the fight, his determination to protect Carol and preserve his sister's memory, driving him to levels of violence he had never imagined possible. The knife that had killed Frank Ramirez and Marshall Edwards found its mark once more, sliding between the leader's ribs with surgical precision. The professional killer's eyes went wide with shock and disbelief as he realized that his years of experience and training had been overcome by a former mine worker fighting for justice rather than money. Quote 330. the leader whispered as his strength ebbed and his weapon fell from nerveless fingers. Quote 33-1, quote 33-2, Kyle replied quietly, stepping back from his fallen opponent while keeping his knife ready in case any fight remained in the man. Quote 3, Lewis finished the firefight by eliminating the third attacker, his final shot ending the threat posed by the cleanup crew. The office was suddenly silent, except for the ringing in everyone's ears from the gunfire and the labored breathing of the survivors as they assessed their situation. Carol remained behind the desk for several moments, her weapon still trained on the doorway in case additional attackers were approaching. But the building remained quiet, suggesting that the cleanup crew had operated as a self-contained unit without backup or support personnel. Is everyone all right? Dr. Alvarez asked, his medical training reasserting itself as he moved to check on his companions for injuries sustained in the firefight. Kyle had taken a bullet in his left arm during a struggle with the leader, but the wound appeared superficial and wasn't affecting his ability to function. Carol was shaken but unharmed, her defensive position having protected her from the worst of the violence. Lewis had sustained minor cuts from flying debris, but nothing that required immediate medical attention. Was 335, Kyle said, pressing a cloth against his wounded arm to control the bleeding. Quote, there I am. Carol struggled to her feet, her pregnant form making the movement difficult, but her determination overriding her physical limitations. She said firmly. Dr. Alvarez gathered the medical files and copied documents, while Lewis secured the customer records and shipping manifests. The evidence they had discovered represented years of systematic crimes and the best hope for reuniting stolen children with their surviving relatives. What else did Lewis ask as they prepared to leave Frank's office and the bodies of their attackers behind? If the network is as extensive as Edwards claimed, they'll have people watching all the normal routes out of town. Carol considered their options, her mind working through the tactical situation with the same clarity she had shown during the firefight. We split up, she decided. Multiple groups carrying copies of the evidence to different destinations. That way, even if some of us are captured, enough will survive to ensure prosecutions. Kyle admired Carol's strategic thinking, but was concerned about her ability to travel in her condition. Your 343 quoted even, Carol replied with quiet confidence. Ukuda 35. Dr. Alvarez completed his examination of Kyle's wound, confirming that the bullet had passed through muscle without hitting bone or major blood vessels. You'll need proper medical attention within a day or two, he warned, but the wound won't prevent you from traveling if necessary. Lewis studied the customer records one final time, memorizing key details in case the physical documents were lost or destroyed. I'll take the transportation records to the territorial capital, he volunteered. My contacts in the freight industry can help verify the shipping information and provide additional evidence about the network's operations. I'll take the medical records to federal prosecutors in Denver, Dr. Alvarez added. My professional credentials will give weight to the testimony about falsified documents and systematic cover-ups. Kyle and Carol would carry the customer files to a different destination, ensuring that the most crucial evidence about the stolen children's locations would have multiple chances to reach honest authorities. The separation was dangerous for all of them, but it maximized the probability that some evidence would survive to bring justice to Frank's victims. As they prepared to leave Frank's office for the last time, Carol took one final look around the room where so much had been revealed and decided. The bodies of Edwards and the cleanup crew served as grim reminders of the network's willingness to use violence to protect their interests, but they also represented the first real defeats the criminal organization had suffered. It's not over, Carol said quietly, her hand resting on her swollen belly as she contemplated the challenges that lay ahead. Even with this evidence, it's going to take years to find all the stolen children and bring all the criminals to justice. But it's a start, Kyle replied, his wounded arm forgotten as he focused on the larger implications of their victory. For the first time, the network is exposed and vulnerable. They can't operate in secret anymore, and they can't silence everyone who knows the truth. The pre-dawn darkness provided cover as a small group of survivors prepared to leave Millbrook and begin their separate journeys to deliver the evidence that could bring down Frank's criminal network. Carol felt the weight of her unborn child as she moved carefully down the stairs from Frank's office, each step a reminder of the life she was carrying and the future she was fighting to protect. Kyle stayed close beside her, his wounded arm making his movements slightly awkward, but his determination undiminished by the injury. The former mine worker had lost everything to Frank's corruption, and the opportunity to ensure justice for his murdered sister drove him forward despite the physical and emotional toll of the night's violence. Dr. Alvarez and Louis Ruiz moved ahead of them, scouting the route to ensure that no additional threats were waiting in the shadows. The cleanup crew's attack had confirmed Edwards' warnings about the network's reach and resources, but it had also revealed that their opponents could be defeated by people willing to fight for justice rather than profit. The streets of Millbrook were eerily quiet as they made their way toward the edge of town, the usual sounds of frontier life muted by the early hour and the storm's aftermath. Puddles of rainwater reflected the fading stars, and the air carried the clean scent of washed earth mixed with the lingering smoke from the saloon's chimneys. Quote 356. Louis said quietly, pointing toward a building near the town's outskirts. I can arrange transportation for everyone, but we'll need to be careful about timing. If the network has people watching the normal routes, they'll be expecting us to use conventional transportation. Carol considered their options, her mind working through the tactical challenges of moving pregnant and wounded people across hostile Aussie territory while carrying evidence that multiple parties wanted to destroy. Can you arrange for decoy passengers? She asked. People who look like us but are actually traveling to different destinations? Louis nodded appreciatively, recognizing the wisdom of Carol's suggestion. Quote 3, sir. Dr. Alvarez examined Kyle's wound one more time, checking for signs of infection or excessive bleeding that might compromise his ability to travel. The injury is stable, he reported, but you'll need to change the dressing regularly and watch for signs of fever. As they reached the stagecoach station, the sound of approaching horses interrupted their planning. Kyle immediately moved to position himself between Carol and the potential threat, his knife ready despite his wounded condition. But the riders who emerged from the darkness were not additional cleanup crew members or network enforcers. Mrs. Gutierrez, called a voice from the lead rider. Are you Carol Gutierrez? Carol stepped forward cautiously, her hand resting on Edward's pistol as she studied the approaching figures. Quote 365. The lead rider dismounted and approached with his hands visible, clearly attempting to appear non-threatening. Quote 360. Kyle remained skeptical, understanding that the network's influence might extend to federal law enforcement just as it had corrupted local officials. How did you receive word? We haven't had time to contact anyone outside of town. Marshal Morrison's expression was grim as he explained his presence. Quote 368. Dr. Alvarez stepped forward, confirming Morrison's explanation. I sent the message after Mrs. Gutierrez and I discussed the evidence we had gathered. I thought it was important to have federal backup in case the situation escalated beyond our ability to handle. Carol studied Morrison's face, looking for signs of deception or hidden agenda. The marshal appeared to be in his 50s, with the weathered features and steady gaze of a career lawman who had seen too much frontier violence. His companions were similarly professional in appearance, their equipment and bearings suggesting legitimate federal authority rather than criminal impersonation. Quote 370. Carol asked, her caution born of the night's repeated encounters with people who weren't what they claimed to be. Morrison produced official credentials and a telegram from the territorial governor's office authorizing his investigation of corruption in Millbrook. The documents appeared genuine, but Carol had learned not to trust appearances when dealing with a network that had infiltrated multiple levels of government. The evidence, Kyle said quietly, recognizing that they would have to take some risks if they wanted to accomplish their mission. If Morrison is legitimate, he can provide the federal protection we need to ensure the records reach honest prosecutors. Carol made her decision, understanding that they couldn't accomplish their goals without trusting someone in authority. Quote 373. Morrison's expression became increasingly grim as Carol outlined the scope of Frank's operations and the network's systematic exploitation of frontier law enforcement limitations. How extensive are we talking about? At least 6 territories, Louis replied, producing the transportation records that documented the network's geographical reach. Quote 376. Dr. Alvarez provided the medical evidence, explaining his role in falsifying death certificates and birth records to cover up the systematic murders. Quote 377. Morrison examined the documents with the practiced eye of an experienced investigator, his face growing darker as he processed the magnitude of the crimes they described. Quote, 378, he said grimly. Quote, 379, quote, 380. Kyle said, producing the customer records that identified the families who had purchased stolen children. Quote, 381. Carol watched Morrison's reaction to the customer records, looking for any sign that he might be connected to the network or influenced by the same corruption that had compromised Edwards and other local officials. But the marshal's disgust appeared genuine, his professional outrage at the systematic exploitation of children overriding any other considerations. Quote 382, Morrison said, organizing his thoughts as he processed the evidence before him. Quote 383, quote 384, Carol replied. Quote 385, Morrison's expression became even more concerned as he realized the implications of Carol's statement. Quote 386, Kyle gestured toward the bodies in Frank's office, understanding that physical evidence would be crucial for establishing the credibility of their accusations. We killed Edwards and 3 members of a cleanup crew who came to eliminate witnesses and destroy evidence. Their bodies and weapons should provide additional proof that this network is willing to use extreme violence to protect their operations. Show me, Morrison said, his federal authority giving him the power to secure crime scenes and preserve evidence in ways that local officials couldn't or wouldn't. The group returned to Frank's office, where Morrison and his deputies began the methodical process of documenting the scene and collecting evidence. The marshal's professional approach to the investigation provided Carol with confidence that they had finally found honest law enforcement officials who could act on the evidence they had gathered. The network's response to exposure tells us everything we need to know about their guilt, Morrison observed as he examined Edwards' body and the weapons used in the firefight. 1239, Jamal Alvarez provided detailed testimony about the medical aspects of Frank's crimes while Morrison's deputies took notes and collected physical evidence. The doctor's professional credentials and willingness to confess his own role in the conspiracy added credibility to the accusations that would be difficult for the network's defenders to dismiss. Lewis explained the transportation aspects of the criminal enterprise, using his industry knowledge to identify the routes and methods used to move stolen children across territorial boundaries. His testimony would be crucial for establishing the interstate nature of the crimes and justifying federal jurisdiction over the investigation. As the sun began to rise over Millbrook, casting golden light through the windows of Frank's office, Carol felt a mixture of exhaustion and cautious optimism. The evidence was finally in the hands of law enforcement officials who appeared willing and able to act on it, but she understood that the fight for justice was far from over. What happens next, she asked Morrison, as his team had completed their initial evidence collection. Federal prosecutors will review the evidence and begin the process of issuing warrants and indictments, Morrison replied. We'll need to coordinate with territorial governments to locate and arrest the network's associates, and we'll begin the process of tracing the stolen children to their current locations. How long will it take? Kyle asked, his wounded arm forgotten as he focused on the possibility of finally achieving justice for his murdered sister and the other victims. Morrison's expression was honest, but not particularly encouraging. Code 395. Carol nodded, understanding that justice would be a long and difficult process, but feeling hope for the first time since arriving in Millbrook. Quote 396, quote 397, Morrison assured her. Quote 398. Dr. Alvarez gathered his remaining medical supplies, preparing to accompany Morrison's team to provide testimony to federal prosecutors. I'll do everything I can to help identify the children and provide medical evidence about their origins. It's the least I can do to atone for my role in these crimes. Lewis prepared to return to his transportation duties, but with a new mission to assist federal investigators in tracing the network's shipping operations. As Morrison's team prepared to escort the evidence and witnesses to federal authorities, Carol felt the familiar movement of her unborn child and realized that her own journey was entering a new phase. The immediate danger had passed, but the responsibility of raising a child in a world where such horrors were possible weighed heavily on her mind. Mrs. Gutierrez, Morrison said as his deputies finished their work, you'll need to provide detailed testimony about your experiences with Frank Ramirez and the threats you faced. Are you prepared for that level of involvement in the prosecution? Carol's hand moved to her swollen belly, feeling the life growing inside her, and thinking about all the children who had been stolen from mothers who would never see them grow up. Quid 403, she said quietly, a quote for four. The journey to the territorial capital took 3 days, with Morrison's federal marshals providing security, while Carol, Kyle, Dr. Alvarez, and Lewis traveled in a reinforced stagecoach designed to protect important witnesses and evidence. Carol's pregnancy made the travel uncomfortable, but her determination to see justice done overrode her physical discomfort. During the journey, Morrison shared additional information about the federal investigation that was already beginning based on Dr. Alvarez's original telegram. We've been tracking suspicious adoption patterns across multiple territories for months, he explained. Your evidence provides the missing pieces we needed to understand the full scope of the operation. Kyle's arm was healing well under Dr. Alvarez's continued care, but the former mine worker remained focused on the larger mission rather than his personal recovery. Have you identified other locations where similar operations might be taking place? He asked. Morrison nodded grimly. At least 4 other towns show patterns similar to what happened in Millbrook. Unexplained disappearances of pregnant women, corrupt local officials, and suspicious freight shipments to the same network of buyers. Your evidence will help us coordinate investigations in all of those locations. Carol felt both encouraged and horrified by Morrison's revelation. The knowledge that Frank's network was even larger than they had imagined meant that dozens of additional children might be reunited with their families, but it also meant that the scope of the crimes was almost incomprehensible. How many children are we talking about? She asked, dreading the answer but needing to understand the full magnitude of what they were fighting. Based on the patterns we've identified, potentially over 100 stolen children across 6 territories, Morrison replied. Some may have been sold to families who genuinely believed they were participating in legitimate adoptions, but others were clearly purchased by people who knew they were buying stolen infants. Dr. Alvarez reviewed his medical records, cross-referencing them with Morrison's information about other locations. Lewis studied his transportation records, identifying connections between different shipping routes that might reveal additional aspects of the network's operations. The freight companies involved weren't just random carriers, he observed. They were specifically chosen for their routes and their willingness to transport cargo without asking questions. That suggests a level of organization and planning that goes beyond what Frank could have managed alone. As they approached the territorial capital, Carol could see the imposing buildings that housed the federal courts and prosecutors' offices where their evidence would be evaluated and acted upon. The sight filled her with both hope and trepidation, understanding that the legal system represented their best chance for justice, but also knowing that powerful interests would work to suppress or discredit their testimony. Morrison's team had arranged for secure accommodations where the witnesses could stay while providing their testimony and working with federal prosecutors to build cases against the network's members. The hotel was modest but clean, and more importantly, it was guarded by federal marshals who could provide protection against any remaining cleanup crews or network enforcers. Quote 415, Morrison explained as they settled into their accommodations. Quote 416. Carol's first meeting with federal prosecutor James Harrison was scheduled for the following morning, giving her time to rest and prepare for what she knew would be an exhaustive examination of her experiences in Millbrook. The prosecutor was a man in his 40s with the serious demeanor of someone who had spent years fighting corruption and organized crime on the frontier. Mrs. Gutierrez, Harrison said as they began her deposition, I want you to understand that your testimony will be crucial for establishing the systematic nature of these crimes. The defense will argue that Frank Ramirez was acting alone, that there was no broader conspiracy. Your evidence helps us prove otherwise. Carol provided detailed testimony about her arrival in Millbrook, Frank's systematic efforts to isolate her, and the pattern of threats and intimidation that had driven her to confront him publicly. She described the records they had found in Frank's safe and the connections those documents revealed to a network of buyers and corrupt officials across multiple territories. The customer records are particularly important, Harrison explained as Carol described the hidden compartment in Frank's safe. Quote 4. Kyle's testimony focused on the violence used to protect the network's operations, from his sister's murder to the cleanup crew's attempt to eliminate witnesses. His detailed knowledge of Frank's methods and the corruption that enabled them provided prosecutors with insights into how the network had operated for so long without detection. Dr. Alvarez's medical testimony was perhaps the most damning, providing professional credibility to accusations that might otherwise seem too horrific to believe. His willingness to confess his own role in the conspiracy and provide detailed information about the systematic falsification of medical records gave prosecutors the evidence they needed to establish the premeditated nature of the crimes. Lewis's transportation records provided the final piece of the puzzle, documenting the movement of stolen children across territorial boundaries and establishing the interstate nature of the conspiracy. His testimony would be crucial for justifying federal jurisdiction and coordinating investigations across multiple territories. As the depositions continued over several days, Carol began to understand the massive scope of the legal proceedings that would be required to bring the network to justice. Hundreds of witnesses would need to be interviewed, thousands of documents would need to be examined, and dozens of suspects would need to be arrested and prosecuted. The process will take years, Harrison explained during a break in Carol's testimony. Quote, "What do I do?" Carol's pregnancy was advancing steadily during the weeks of testimony and legal preparation, but she remained focused on the mission of ensuring justice for Frank's victims. Dr. Alvarez monitored her condition carefully, confirming that both she and her baby remained healthy despite the stress of the legal proceedings. Quote 423, Dr. Alvarez reported after one of his examinations. Quote 424. Carol had been thinking about the same issues, understanding that her child's birth would mark a new chapter in her life, but also knowing that her responsibility to Frank's victims wouldn't end with the delivery. "I want my child to be born into a world where justice is possible," she said quietly. "That means seeing this prosecution through to completion, no matter how long it takes." The first arrests based on their evidence began within 2 weeks of their arrival in the territorial capital. Federal marshals coordinated with local law enforcement to apprehend corrupt officials, network associates, and some of the buyers who had knowingly purchased stolen children. Each arrest provided additional evidence and testimony that strengthened the overall case against the conspiracy. "We've arrested 12 suspects so far," Morrison reported during one of his regular briefings. 3 corrupt law enforcement officials, 4 freight company operators, and 5 buyers who clearly knew they were purchasing stolen children. Each arrest is leading to additional evidence and more suspects. Kyle felt a mixture of satisfaction and continued determination as he watched the network's systematic destruction through legal proceedings. Quote 429, Harrison nodded, his expression showing the first signs of optimism Carol had seen since meeting him. Quote 430. Carol felt tears of joy at the news of the first successful reunifications, understanding that each child returned to their family represented a victory against the evil that had consumed Frank Ramirez and his associates. Quote 431 to then, quote 432, Harrison replied. Quote 433. Dr. Alvarez continued to provide medical testimony while also working with federal investigators to identify other doctors who might have been involved in similar conspiracies. Quote 434, he reported. Quote 35. As Carol's due date approached, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from a desperate pregnant widow fleeing to an unknown town to a key witness in one of the largest federal prosecutions in territorial history. The child growing inside her would be born into a world where justice was still imperfect, but also into a world where people were willing to fight for what was right. The contractions began on a quiet Tuesday morning as Carol was reviewing testimony transcripts in her hotel room. Dr. Alvarez was summoned immediately, his medical expertise ensuring that both mother and child would receive the best possible care during the delivery. "It's time," Dr. Alvarez announced after examining Carol. "The baby is ready to be born." Kyle remained nearby throughout the labor, his presence providing comfort and support as Carol brought new life into the world. The former mine worker had become more than an ally in their fight for justice. He had become family, someone whose commitment to protecting the innocent matched her own. The birth was difficult but successful, with Carol delivering a healthy daughter who announced her arrival with strong cries that echoed through the hotel room. Dr. Alvarez performed the delivery with the same skill and dedication he had shown throughout their journey. his medical expertise unmarred by his previous involvement in Frank's conspiracy. Quote 438, and Kyle said quietly as he looked at the newborn infant, his weathered face showing emotions he rarely allowed himself to express. Quote 439. Carol held her daughter close, feeling the weight of new responsibility mixed with the worst of successful motherhood. Quote on, she said without hesitation, honoring Kyle's murdered sister and all the other women who had died at Frank's hands. Quote 4411. The birth of Maria Gutierrez marked a turning point not just in Carol's personal journey, but in the broader fight for justice against the criminal network that had terrorized pregnant women across the American West. As Carol held her newborn daughter, she understood that the child represented hope for a future where such systematic evil could not operate in darkness and silence. Dr. Alvarez examined both mother and child, confirming that the delivery had proceeded without complications, despite the stress and uncertainty of the previous months. Both of you are healthy and strong, he reported with genuine satisfaction. Maria appears to be a perfectly normal, healthy infant, and you've recovered from the delivery remarkably well. Kyle remained at Carol's bedside, his presence providing the kind of steady support that had sustained her throughout their fight against Frank's network. The former mine worker had found new purpose in protecting Carol and her child, understanding that they represented the future he and his sister had been denied by Frank's cruelty. Quote 444. Kyle said quietly as he watched the sleeping infant. Quote 45. Federal prosecutor Marsh Harrison visited Carol within days of Maria's birth, bringing news of additional arrests and successful reunifications that demonstrated the continuing impact of their evidence. We've now arrested 27 suspects and reunited 12 children with their families, he reported. The network is collapsing as more witnesses come forward and more evidence is discovered. Carol listened to the updates while nursing her daughter, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction that their sacrifices were producing tangible results. What about the buyers who claimed they thought they were participating in legitimate adoptions? Some were genuinely deceived, Harrison replied, but others clearly knew they were purchasing stolen children. We're treating each case individually, with prosecution decisions based on the evidence of intent and knowledge. The families who were deceived are often eager to cooperate with our investigation. Luis Ruiz had returned to his transportation duties, but remained available to provide additional testimony as needed. His detailed knowledge of shipping routes and freight operations continued to help investigators trace the movement of stolen children and identify additional suspects in the conspiracy. The freight companies involved are facing federal charges for their role in interstate transportation of stolen persons, Morrison reported during one of his visits. Several company owners are cooperating with the investigation in exchange for reduced sentences, providing us with even more evidence about the network's operations. Dr. Alvarez divided his time between caring for Carol and Maria and working with federal investigators to identify other medical professionals who might have been involved in similar conspiracies. His willingness to confess his own crimes and provide detailed testimony had encouraged other doctors to come forward with information about systematic medical record falsification. We've identified at least 6 other doctors who were involved in covering up similar crimes, Dr. Alvarez reported. Most are willing to cooperate with the investigation once they understand that the network can no longer protect them from prosecution. As Maria grew stronger during her first weeks of life, Carol began to understand how her daughter's existence represented a victory against the evil that had threatened to consume them both. The child who had been marked for theft and sale by Frank's network was instead growing up in freedom, surrounded by people who had risked everything to ensure her safety. The first major trial began 6 months after Maria's birth, with Carol providing key testimony about Frank's systematic targeting of pregnant women and the network's methods of operation. Her appearance in court, holding her healthy daughter, provided powerful visual evidence of what the network's victims had lost when their children were stolen and they were murdered. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Prosecutor Harrison said during his opening statement, you will hear testimony about crimes so systematic and horrific that they challenge our understanding of human evil. But you will also hear about people like Carol Gutierrez, who risked everything to ensure that justice could prevail. The defense attorneys attempted to portray Frank as a lone criminal whose actions didn't reflect a broader conspiracy, but the evidence Carol and her allies had gathered made such arguments impossible to sustain. The customer records, shipping manifests, and medical documentation clearly established the systematic nature of the crimes and the involvement of multiple conspirators. Kyle's testimony about the violence used to protect the network's operations was particularly powerful. His detailed account of Frank's confession and the cleanup crew's attack providing the jury with clear evidence of the lengths to which the conspirators would go to protect their interests. Quote 457, Kyle testified, his voice steady despite the emotional weight of his words. Quote 458, Dr. Alvarez's medical testimony provided the scientific credibility needed to establish the systematic falsification of records and the deliberate concealment of evidence. His professional expertise, combined with his willingness to confess his own role in the conspiracy, gave weight to accusations that might otherwise seem too extreme to believe. I falsified death certificates and birth records on at least 15 occasions, Dr. Alvarez testified. Each falsification was designed to conceal evidence of murder and child theft. I was paid substantial sums to ensure that the official records would never reveal the true nature of these crimes. The trial lasted for 3 weeks, with dozens of witnesses providing testimony about different aspects of the network's operations. Parents who had lost children, law enforcement officials who had been corrupted, and even some of the buyers who had purchased stolen infants all contributed to a comprehensive picture of systematic criminal enterprise. The jury's verdict was unanimous, guilty on all counts for the defendants who had been directly involved in the conspiracy. The sentences were severe, reflecting both the heinous nature of the crimes and the systematic way in which they had been carried out over multiple years. The defendants in this case participated in crimes that strike at the very heart of human decency, the judge said during sentencing. The systematic murder of pregnant women and theft of their children represents evil of a magnitude that demands the harshest possible punishment under federal law. Frank's primary associates received life sentences, while the corrupt officials who had enabled the network received terms ranging from 20 to 40 years in federal prison. The buyers who had knowingly purchased stolen children received lighter sentences in exchange for their cooperation with ongoing investigations. Carol felt a deep sense of satisfaction as she watched the sentencing, understanding that justice had finally been achieved for Frank's victims and their stolen children. But she also understood that the fight for justice was an ongoing process, not a single victory that could be celebrated and then forgotten. This is just the beginning, Prosecutor Harrison explained as the first trial concluded. We have evidence of similar networks operating in other territories, and we're committed to pursuing every lead until all the criminals involved in these enterprises are brought to justice. The successful prosecution in Millbrook became a model for similar investigations across the American West, with federal authorities using the evidence and methods developed during Carol's case to expose and prosecute other child trafficking networks. The precedent established by the convictions made it much more difficult for such conspiracies to operate in the future. Kyle had found new purpose in his role as a federal witness and investigator, using his knowledge of frontier life and criminal methods to help identify and expose other networks. His commitment to protecting innocent children honored his sister's memory, while also providing him with a sense of meaning that had been missing since her death. Dr. Alvarez continued his medical practice, but also worked as a consultant to federal investigators, helping to identify patterns of medical record falsification that might indicate the presence of similar criminal networks. His expertise and credibility as a reformed conspirator made him uniquely valuable for such investigations. Luis Ruiz expanded his transportation business while also serving as an informant for federal marshals, using his industry connections to identify suspicious shipping patterns that might indicate criminal activity. His role in exposing Frank's network had earned him respect and trust from law enforcement officials across multiple territories. As Maria celebrated her first birthday, Carol reflected on the journey that had brought them from desperation and danger to safety and justice. The child who had been marked for theft by Frank's network was instead growing up in a world where such systematic evil could no longer operate with impunity. She'll never know how close she came to being stolen, Carol said as she watched Maria taking her first tentative steps around their new home in the territorial capital. But she'll grow up understanding that justice is possible when people are willing to fight for it. Kyle had become an unofficial uncle to Maria, his protective presence providing the child with the kind of stable male influence that Carol wanted her daughter to have. The former mine worker's commitment to their family honored both his sister's memory and his own need for redemption through service to others. The final count of successful reunifications reached 43 children returned to their families, with additional cases still being investigated and processed through the federal court system. Each reunion represented a victory against the evil that had consumed Frank Ramirez and his network, proof that justice could prevail even against the most systematic and protected criminal enterprises. "The network is finished," Morrison reported during his final briefing on the case. "We've arrested or indicted every major figure involved in the conspiracy, and the systematic nature of our prosecutions has made it impossible for similar networks to operate using the same methods." Carol understood that the fight against such evil would never be completely finished, that new threats would emerge and new battles would need to be fought. But she also understood that their victory had established important precedents and created systems that would make future criminal networks more difficult to establish and maintain. As she held Maria and looked toward the future, Carol Gutierrez knew that her daughter would grow up in a world where pregnant women could seek help without fearing for their lives, where children could not be stolen and sold with impunity, and where justice was more than just a distant hope. The price of achieving that future had been high, paid in blood and sacrifice by people who understood that some battles must be fought regardless of the personal cost. The pregnant woman who had once faced Frank Ramirez with nothing but desperate courage had become a mother whose testimony had brought down a criminal empire and saved dozens of innocent lives. Her transformation from victim to victor represented the best of human nature's response to evil, proof that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary justice when they refused to accept the unacceptable. In the end, Carol Gutierrez had done more than survive Frank Ramirez's cruelty. She had ensured that no other woman would suffer the fate that had been planned for her, and no other child would be stolen from their murdered mother. That legacy would live on in Maria's future and in the safer world their sacrifice had helped to create.